Some cases are so dark and disturbing that they defy understanding for those of us with compassion and a sense of morality. Yet, there are individuals among us who seem entirely devoid of humanity. This is one of those stories, one that will leave you wondering why and questioning whether it's possible to ever truly know someone, as some minds are capable of unimaginable evil. One Friday evening in a peaceful London neighborhood, a young woman left for what was meant to be a short walk to meet her date for dinner. It was a routine part of her life, an act that everyone deserves to feel safe doing. But this time was different. This time she never made it back home. Before we get into it, let me take you into the heart of London, but not the bustling center you might imagine. No, we're actually heading to a place called Kidbrooke Village, a hidden gem nestled in southeast London's royal borough of Greenwich. Now, it's a much sought-after address, but this charming village was once a post-war wasteland. It was a relic of World War II, and the site used to serve as a base for the Royal Air Force before laying dormant until the late 1960s, when it was transformed into the infamous Fair Estate, which was an urban housing complex. It consisted of 74 blocks, ranging from 2-story houses to 13-floor towers, and it had a lot of promise. However, it ended up becoming a symbol of failed urban planning when it began to deteriorate, and people started to leave. By 2006, it was completely abandoned, leaving it looking like a post-apocalyptic ghost town. That is until 2009, when a new vision for the area emerged from its desolate foundation. A £1 billion regeneration project breathed life into this barren land. They demolished everything, and by 2010, Kidbrooke Village was born. It's a self-contained, idyllic blend of modern living and natural beauty. It sounds like I'm doing an ad, but it is now a thriving community with parks, ponds, and plenty of green spaces. At its heart lies Cator Park, an 86-acre oasis perfect for family fun. It's a popular place for picnics, bike rides, and playing outdoors, especially with its close to 3-acre designated playground. Kidbrooke Village has everything, so residents don't really need to leave. It has 2 on-site primary schools with really good ratings, and the village center consists of residents-only gyms, a Sainsbury's supermarket, as well as a 24-hour corner service in the retail hub. Now, it doesn't have a bustling nightlife, but there are a few cute pubs and restaurants within walking distance from the townhomes and apartments nearby. At this point, I think you get the idea. Modern suburban living, a great place to raise children, but with the excitement and opportunities of London. Well, now that I've set the stage for you, I'll let you know that when this case took place, it was said that there had not been a murder in this location in over 50 years. That is, until an emergency call came in to the Metropolitan Police Department on the evening of September 18, 2021. It was around 5:30 p.m. when a local Kidbrooke resident explained to the emergency operator that he'd been walking his dog through Cator Park when he got to the backside of the youth community center called One Space. His dog began sniffing in a more erratic manner toward an area of tall grass off the path of the sidewalk. At first glance, the man thought his dog had found a potato sack in the bushes. I know, why would a potato sack be there? But this was what he thought his mind would recognize. As he got closer, he realized it was a person that he actually believed had been simply resting or even sleeping. But as he got even closer, he noticed it appeared to be a young woman. He could see she was wearing a pair of sparkly boots and a black outfit, so he called out to her, believing that maybe she had a few too many drinks the night before and passed out. However, he did think it was strange that it looked like she was covered in leaves, so he crouched down and began to talk to her. She wasn't responding, and that's when he explained he brushed off some of those leaves and saw a lot of flies hovering around, which was his first clue that something wasn't right. Still, his mind wasn't registering what he was looking at. Upon further inspection, the position that she was in didn't seem natural. Her boots were facing the sky, her neck was almost turned all the way back, and then he noticed the blood. Still, he attempted to find a sign of life by feeling her neck for a pulse, but there wasn't one, and she clearly wasn't breathing. He knew that he needed to call 999, but his phone was dead, So he ran to a person nearby who had been in the same area, looking through the grass for a gold necklace they had lost. He told them he had just found a body and asked if he could borrow their phone. As you can probably imagine, this was an extremely shocking and traumatizing experience for these two residents. To find a body in a popular, well-traveled park in this very safe, close-knit community. Anyone could have stumbled upon the scene. There were so many children playing in this area and so many families enjoying the beautiful weather that weekend. It didn't seem real that a person was lying dead right there in the middle of the park. Of course, the police acted fast. Senior Metropolitan Police Detective Inspector Neil John and Detective Inspector Joe Geedy were leading this investigation, and as soon as the team got on the scene, they began cordoning off the area where the body had been found. They put up a blue tent around the remains so that onlookers would not be able to catch a glimpse, or worse, take pictures. It was clear that the woman had suffered a violent death and that they were dealing with a homicide. Most of the injuries that could be seen during the preliminary examination were to her head. A crime scene manager was called in. They're responsible for the forensic response to major crime scenes. What's important to note, and we don't always think about this, is that when you're dealing with an outdoor crime scene, it's much different than dealing with finding a body, let's say, at a house, for example. When the crime scene is inside a building or a home, all the evidence is usually contained within the walls of that location, and investigators don't have to worry so much about things being contaminated due to inclement weather, for instance. The person they find deceased usually has some connection to where they were found. Maybe they lived there, or maybe the person who did this to them lived there. Those connections are a lot easier to make than finding someone outside and not knowing who they are, where they're from, and how they got there. There's going to be a lot of questions. No matter where a body is found, there are a lot more unknowns when you're dealing with a crime scene outside. Did they die there? Were they placed there after they were killed? Of course, the condition of their body could be worse because of the elements. The heat, maybe the rain, maybe insect activity. All of those things compound an already very complicated situation. The forensics team noticed the same things that I told you the police had observed. It was clear this woman had suffered from head injuries. She had definitely been beaten with something, but there was no weapon nearby. However, there were other important aspects in relation to her body that told a story. The body is the first place you're going to find a lot of clues about the crime. So in this case, the first thing investigators were looking at was the body itself, and then they were going to work outward. She was partially nude. Her top had been pulled all the way up, exposing her bra. Her skirt was also pulled up, and she wasn't wearing anything on the bottom except for her boots. Her body was positioned in a very provocative manner, in a sexually suggestive way. She was face up, her hands were in both of her coat pockets, and her legs were spread apart and positioned upward. She had been covered in leaves in a sloppy attempt to conceal her remains, but there was one thing that stood out right away as very odd. There wasn't a lot of blood in the location where the body was found, even though she had very significant injuries. Investigators knew this meant she probably was attacked somewhere else and then brought to this location. Maybe she was moved so that she would be more visible to the public, to shock onlookers. Maybe, especially with the way she was positioned, it seemed like this was a way to shame her, to humiliate her even in death. Or this could have been a way so that she was found easier. They don't know, but now they have to find out where she was before she was brought there, which meant that their crime scene was about to get a lot bigger, and that can make it even more difficult to search for clues. The easy part in this case was actually identifying the victim. In most cases, that takes some time, but her passport was inside her coat pocket. The badly beaten woman that was found deceased in Cator Park was 28-year-old Sabina Nessa. Of course, when she was identified, the very next step was to contact her family as soon as possible. You don't want them to find out about this on the news, through media. You want them to be informed properly. But you also need to gather as much information from her family as possible, because maybe her family knew why she was in that location, or who she was with last, or if there was anyone who might want to harm her. It's difficult to quantify the devastation Sabina's family felt when they were notified of her death. Her parents had immigrated to the UK for a better and safer life for their family, and now they were about to learn their daughter had been murdered. Before I go there, let me tell you who Sabina Nessa was. Her father, Abdar Ralph, and her mother, Aban Nessa, arrived in London from Bangladesh back in 1980. Her father found a job working as a chef, and soon the couple would welcome 4 daughters. Sabina was the oldest. She was born in North London in 1991. And then just under a year later, Sabina was born on October 23, 1992, in Greenwich. At this point, the family moved to a red brick semi-detached council house on a quiet cul-de-sac in the town of Sandy, which is located in central Bedfordshire. 10 years after Sabina was born, 2 more daughters would complete their family. Sabina's parents still lived in the same home when this tragedy occurred. They raised their daughters there, and they even became property owners by purchasing that home for £35,000. Since they'd been in the neighborhood for so long, they were very well known, very well liked, and respected by their close-knit community. Everyone loved the Nessa girls. They were familiar faces in this area, known to be lovely young women who came from a really good family. Sabina and her older sister, Sabina, were very close. They had a very strong bond that continued throughout their adulthood. When they were little, the 2 of them shared a bedroom, and they loved to pretend they were teachers. They would actually go back and forth, with one pretending they were the student and the other the teacher, and then they would switch. Sabina always took her role as a teacher very seriously. It was her nature to want to help others. The girls' close-knit family's Muslim faith was important to them, and Sabina would often raise money to give to individuals that were experiencing poverty back in her parents' homeland in Bangladesh. But beyond that, Sabina wanted to make sure she learned as much as she could because she saw the hardships her parents faced, being unable to speak and write in English. Sabina actually made sure that she was able to step in for her mom and dad. She was the one that would deal with anything that came to replying to letters or answering to administrators at her school. She would interpret for her parents so that they were informed about what was going on. Sabina valued education from a very young age because she knew it would help her have a better life one day. She was known to be hungry for knowledge, and she would spend all of her extra money buying books. She always had a book with her, and when technology advanced, Sabina would enjoy reading the news on her phone, which was one of her daily routines. The sisters also enjoyed nature. They loved riding their bikes together in the park, and they had a lot of free space to play outside where they lived. Sabina was never happier than when she was outside. She loved animals as well. First, the girls had some birds as pets, and then they got 3 cats that they absolutely adored. Sabina just had such a caring nature about her. She was very lovable. She was also an excellent student. She got straight A's in school, and she enjoyed all of her subjects, but she really liked English and math. After Sabina graduated high school in 2011, the pretend games that she used to play with her sister became her reality. She decided she wanted to be a teacher. She was the kind of person who wanted to make a difference in the world by inspiring the minds of children. But it didn't end there. She dreamed of being a head teacher one day and going to teach a language to children abroad in Dubai. She loved kids. As a matter of fact, her loving and caring side made her a great aunt to her sister Sabina's children. When Sabina got married and moved to London, Sabina followed not too long afterward. She didn't want to be far from her closest sibling. They were like best friends. When Sabina moved to London, she enrolled at Greenwich University and studied sociology, graduating in 2014. Her personal tutor during her degree courses, Dr. Louis Owen Zukan, said that Sabina loved learning and she didn't have a bad bone in her body, and she was looking forward to Sabina making a difference in her future pupils' lives one day. After completing her undergraduate degree, Sabina went on to do a master's in teaching at the University of Bedfordshire. She wasn't all work and no fun though. She was actually very outgoing and social. Out of the Nessa family, she was the only extrovert. She was loud, silly, opinionated, but kind-hearted, and she was always making jokes. Her nieces would describe her as crazy, but what they meant was that she had a lot of energy and random outbursts of laughter. She spent a lot of time with them when they were little toddlers. She absolutely loved fashion, so she would introduce them to her favorite clothes and makeup. Sabina loved to shop. She liked buying makeup, purses, and shoes, and enjoyed getting dressed up and looking pretty. And she was very pretty. She had long dark hair, olive skin, and striking dark soulful eyes, and sometimes she liked to wear light-colored contact lenses. She definitely stood out in a crowd, not only because of her looks, but because of the energy she brought with her wherever she went. She was described as being full of fun and a beautiful, kind soul. A girly girl, generous, funny, and determined, and that sums her up in words. But to really know Sabina was to truly love her, and her students loved her. Yes, she did end up becoming a teacher. After finishing her master's degree, Sabina obtained a qualification from Cambridge to teach English as a foreign language. She was well on her way to achieving all of her goals. For Sabina, life was good. Just a year after finishing her education, she landed her dream job in 2020. She became a Year 1 teacher at Rushy Green Primary School in Leash. She had a class full of 5- and 6-year-old students, and she treated each one of them as if they were unique. For instance, if a student liked chess, she would start a chess club so that the other kids could get involved in what that student liked. She wanted all of her students to feel loved and included. According to her family, friends, and colleagues, Sabina took her first teaching job in this low-income area of London because she was well aware of the many challenges and discrimination children face. She knew that there was going to be a lot of suffering going on in the world, and she wanted to try her best to make a difference in these children's lives. She wanted them to tear down any barriers of disadvantage they may have so that they could reach their full potential. And even though Sabina had only been at the school a short amount of time, she made a big impact. Head teacher Lisa Williams described Sabina as a brilliant teacher and absolutely dedicated to her students. She would come to school early before anyone else, and she treated her classroom like her home. Lisa said Sabina would often buy flowers on her way to school and then display them in her classroom so everyone could enjoy them. And when the school chefs, Luke and Rob, began growing a few herbs and vegetables in the garden on the school grounds, Sabina was the first teacher to take her class to go have a look. She was always involved in everything that was going on with everyone. She chose to eat lunch with her students every day without fail, and she wouldn't just sit there watching them quietly. She would get involved. She would talk to them, encourage them, and she was part of their lives in more ways than just being their teacher. However, as passionate as Sabina was in ensuring other people's children were cared for, family always came first. There was a time when one of her nephew's parents could not afford lunch for him, and Sabina, discreet but generous, paid for his food so that he could eat with his classmates and not feel left out. Sabina always made time for her family, no matter how busy she got. She would speak with Sabina all the time, at least a few times a week, if not more. She still made time to visit her parents' home and beers. She would never come empty-handed either. She would burst through those doors with many shopping bags full of items, including flowers, clothes, and presents. Sabina was a bright light, selfless, always smiling, especially when talking about her students. When she visited with her family, she would share the latest thing that one of the kids in her class said or did, or even a picture they had drawn for her. She was so proud of each of them. Sabina lived in an apartment in Kidbrooke Village, off of AEL Road. I'm going to be showing this on the map if you're watching. If not, it's quite all right. I always explain everything. These apartments were part of that regeneration plan I told you about that began in 2010. They're luxury-style apartments that come fully furnished with modern designer kitchens and bathrooms, hardwood floors, mood lighting, and spacious balconies overlooking the beautiful landscaping and green areas throughout Kidbrooke. They even have a concierge service and an on-site gym, everything you would need. Sabina lived with her roommate, and she was very proud of their living space. She would bring fresh flowers home and put them around the apartment. Sabina loved the nearby Cator Park. There was an entrance that was only a couple of minutes' walk from her building, and she would go there all the time to enjoy the outdoors. She also enjoyed exploring new places with her friends. Living in London meant plenty of nightlife attractions and restaurants, and Sabina enjoyed all it had to offer. She was also nearing 30 years old and thinking about her future and having kids of her own one day, but she never got the chance to experience that because she never made it to age 29. Her body was found just a month before her next birthday and just 200 feet from her front door, lying lifeless in the sprawling Cator Park. Now let's jump back to the investigation. Authorities were doing their best to locate Sabina's next of kin to make that death notification. Meanwhile, they expanded this crime scene and cordoned off a larger portion of the park. They brought in drones and began combing the area for evidence, but they weren't really finding anything significant by doing the normal line search of the park. Sabina's body was found on the backside of the One Space Community Youth Center. There's a skate park and meeting areas, and One Space is a Christian community center on the edge of the Kidbrooke village development. The building has a cafe, as well as offices where young people could meet up. At this point, they didn't know when Sabina had been killed, so they began looking for witnesses who may have seen something out of the ordinary. At the same time, investigators began looking for nearby cameras that might have captured the attack on video. Luckily, since this was a newer development, this park had a number of cameras along the pathways, so they went about obtaining all of the CCTV footage they could. Sabina's body was then removed and taken to the mortuary for a post-mortem examination. It didn't take long for people to notice all of the commotion that was happening in the middle of their community. It was quite obvious by the blue tent in the park that someone had died there, and of course, everyone wanted to know what was going on in such a popular and well-traveled area where kids and families walk every single day. Soon, there was a lot of buzz within the community. People were walking up, they were asking officers what happened. But of course, the authorities remained tight-lipped until they had more information and had notified Sabina's loved ones. All night, officers stood guard outside the park perimeter so that no evidence would be disturbed, and by the next day, Sabina's mother and father, as well as a couple of her sisters, had been notified about the heartbreaking news. Even though Sabina was so close and had infrequent communication with her sister, she had no idea Sabina was missing until she got the news that her body had been found. Can you imagine? Her phone rang in the morning on Sunday, September 19th, the morning after Sabina had been discovered. Sabina was busy with her kids, so her husband answered, and she actually thought that it was going to be Sabina calling. But instead, it was one of their other sisters to inform them that Sabina was dead. When Sabina's husband relayed the news, she was in shock. She said her whole world fell apart, and she later said she couldn't have imagined the horror of that call. Sabina and her husband immediately left their home and made their way to their parents' house in Bedfordshire. They didn't have much information up to this point. The only thing they knew was that Sabina had been found deceased. While they were on their way, Sabina was so desperate for information about what happened to her sister that she was frantically conducting Google searches from her phone. The only information she was able to find was that the body of a young woman had been found close to where Sabina lived, and at that point, she made her husband pull the car over to the side of the road. She began yelling and saying, "Could this be Sabina?" She described the journey to her parents' house as horrendous. Even when she and her husband arrived, the wait wasn't over. It took another hour for the police to meet them there, and Sabina said that this was the longest hour of their lives. When the authorities did arrive, they gave her family even more bad news. Not only had Sabina been found deceased, but she had also been murdered. As you can imagine, her parents were absolutely devastated and beside themselves with grief. They were inconsolable, and Sabina's father, it's so sad, went door to door in their neighborhood to deliver the news in person about the death of his daughter to all their neighbors. I can't imagine how horrible this poor family must have felt. You do not think that something like this will ever happen to someone so close to you, and that's exactly what Sabina said, that she never thought that they'd be going through something like this. Who would have wanted this kind young woman dead? That's what everyone wanted and needed to know. Investigators had to work backward to find out what Sabina was doing before she was killed. So the next investigators had to work backward to find out what Sabina was doing before she was killed. So the next person they wanted to interview was Sabina's roommate. This is when some context is finally added to Sabina's story. Her roommate told investigators that on Friday night, September 17th, Sabina was going on a first date with a guy that she met earlier that year. They had plans to meet at a local bar and restaurant called Depot. Here in the US, we would actually pronounce this as Depot, but it's in an area of Kidbrooke called Pegler Square, where all the other shops, restaurants, and businesses are located. It's a nice modern establishment with booths outside in the beer garden, so you can enjoy a meal and a drink under the night sky. Inside, there's a full bar and lots of cozy couches and booths and tables to sit at. Sabina's roommate said that she had gotten all glammed up, wanting to look her best in anticipation of her night out. She was excited to be finally meeting up with this guy that she had been talking to after their friendship had turned into something more recently. Investigators asked if Sabina seemed nervous about this meetup, and her roommate said no, not nervous. She was happy about seeing him. However, she was running late. On Fridays, the depot closes at 11 p.m., and they stop serving food at 9:30. Sabina was still at her apartment when her date texted her a little before 8:30 via WhatsApp, letting her know he was already at the depot and he asked where she was. She told him that she was just about to leave, and that was around 8:32 p.m. Now it's obvious that Sabina was running behind, and she wasn't driving that night since she knew she might have a few drinks. The walk from her place to the depot via the main roadway would have only taken roughly 12 minutes. However, she wasn't found on the main road. She was found inside the park. If she had cut through the park, it would have shaved off at least a few minutes. Considering the investigators now realized that Sabina didn't want to keep her date waiting, they assumed she took a shortcut through the park. Someone either followed her, crossed her path, or they knew that she would be there, and they took that opportunity to attack and kill her. But it still didn't make sense. The thing is, this wasn't typical for Sabina. Her roommate explained that she was very cautious, and she even mentioned in the past that she was nervous about being in that park at night, even though it was in a safe area. She would rather take the long way anytime she was going to Pegler Square. She was never able to explain exactly why she got a bad vibe from Cator Park at night. Maybe it was the looming shadows of the tall trees, or maybe it was intuition about the role that this area would later play in her future. We will never know, but on this occasion, she must have made a compromise. Her roommate told investigators that she became worried later that night when Sabina had not returned to their apartment. She began texting her, but not getting an answer, and she said it wasn't like her not to reply to messages. She also told investigators that she never thought something like this could happen to her, and she no longer feels safe living there. Many people would feel the same way once the word got out about Sabina's murder. It was still only a couple of days after she had been found, so the information provided to the public was sparse. The night of Sabina's murder, the London sunset was at 7:10 p.m., so it would have already been dark when Sabina left her apartment. But even at that hour, there would have been people in the park, some doing the same thing Sabina was doing, taking a shortcut to bars or restaurants, or making their way home from work. So maybe someone saw something. Of course, the next person investigators wanted to speak with was Sabina's date, a man that they found out was 10 years older than her, and he might have been the last person to have contact with her. They actually arrested him under suspicion of murder, and they held him for questioning because 90% of women are killed by someone they know, so they started there. But to cut to the chase, it was clear that this man was not involved, so he was free to go. However, they had a better lead, an eyewitness. It wasn't a person, it was CCTV footage. London is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, with recent estimates suggesting that there are between 600,000 to close to 1 million cameras in the city. Many of these cameras are operated by businesses or private entities, which can make it hard to gain access to them. But in this case, the community in the immediate area was outraged when they found out a woman had been brutally murdered just steps from her front door in a park that was considered safe. Several camera owners actually submitted footage to investigators. They had dashboard cameras, doorbell cameras, and security footage. Investigators had already accessed the park's CCTV footage from the area right near where Sabina's body was found. And even though it is newer equipment, we know these videos are notoriously grainy and of bad quality. And this footage was no exception. But it was all they had. They began looking at it right after 8:30 p.m. on Friday night. And hauntingly, they soon realized that Sabina's entire murder was captured on video. Although they couldn't make out any characteristics of the person who killed her, because the position of the camera was overhead, they couldn't see facial features, ascertain ethnicity, age, or even the color of their clothing. They couldn't make an identification, but it appeared to be a male subject. But now they've answered one question. They know how Sabina was killed. I'm going to warn you, this is very brutal and shocking. Now, of course, they never released the actual footage, but the official reports have described it in detail. First, they were able to identify Sabina from the description her roommate gave them of what she was wearing that night: a dark top, a skirt, tights, a coat, and sparkly boots. Through the various cameras, they spot Sabina crossing a small bridge from Astel Road near her apartment complex in the park. She continued to walk on the footpath. Next, she crossed over Cambert Way and continued to walk on the main sidewalk through the park. That's when the camera captured a hooded figure that emerged from under the trees. He walked in her direction and actually crossed her path. He looked straight at her as she continued to make her way towards the direction of the depot. The attacker kept walking away from her. It was as though he was looking around to make sure no one was close by. Then he quickly turned back towards Sabina's direction and looked her way, probably making sure that that area was clear as well. Then he ran back to where Sabina was at a very rapid pace, approaching her from behind with something in his hand. Right when he was on her heels, she probably heard his footsteps because she started to turn her head behind her, and that's when he began a frenzied attack on this poor woman. It was just blow after blow in very quick succession, again and again and again, striking her in the head and face repeatedly without warning. Sabina was completely caught off guard, but she did attempt to defend herself. Sadly, she was no match for how ferocious this beating was. The investigators slowed the video down and counted 34 strikes to Sabina's head. 34. Finally, Sabina collapsed right over a park bench. She appeared to be unconscious at this point, and the perpetrator literally threw this poor girl over his shoulder and carried her toward that area that was not within the view of the cameras. It's up a bank and covered with tall grass and several trees, and for the next 10 minutes there's no sign of Sabina or her attacker. But then, only he re-emerges from the area where Sabina's body was ultimately found. He makes his way back to that bench and begins picking up pieces of the weapon that he used to harm Sabina. It had broken during this attack. That's the force he used. It wasn't clear what this item was at the time, but then the attacker is seen going back to where Sabina was taken off camera, and he's gone for another 10 minutes. There's no way to know what he was doing to her in that 20 minutes that the cameras didn't catch his actions, but there are clues, and it's not good. After that second 10-minute period off camera, he returned to the bench a second time and took out what appeared to be wet wipes. He began wiping down the bench where Sabina had fallen. Clearly, this man knew a thing or two about forensics because he was manipulating this crime scene. He was trying to get rid of any evidence of him or Sabina being in that location. But now that investigators know where the murder took place, they made that their new focus. They swabbed the bench and the surrounding area for blood, DNA, and dusted for any fingerprints that may have been left behind. Because they knew what Sabina was wearing before the attack, They were also able to conclude that the killer removed her tights as well as her underwear because she was not wearing either of those items when she was found. However, what struck them as very odd was the fact that the attacker would have had to remove her boots to take off the underwear and tights, but Sabina was found with her boots on both her feet. Therefore, this pervert took his time to put them back on her after what he did to her. With the way that she was posed, it would have enabled him to have full, intimate access to her. According to detectives, there didn't seem to be any other reason to remove those lower items of clothing, exposing her top half and leaving her legs open, unless there had been sexual conduct, especially because he took that clothing with him from the scene, most likely to avoid there ever being a trace of his DNA being found on them. Either that, or investigators suggested he could have taken them as trophies. But considering they watched him clean up the scene, they believed it was the former theory, a sexually motivated crime to take advantage of a beautiful woman who was walking all alone at night. He targeted her. He was watching, waiting, stalking that park, looking for prey. They now believe that this could actually be a random attack, and that this man may not have had any connection with Sena, but they couldn't be sure. After the savage attack, the man is seen pulling his hood back over his head and casually walking away around 8:56 p.m. He could have gone anywhere, because once he walked out of the south side of the cameras, they weren't sure in which direction he left. This park is pretty big, with many different ways to come and go. The CCTV in the park doesn't cover every nook and cranny, just the main path. So they wondered, did this man walk here or drive? Does he live nearby? Was he casing this area for a while? They don't know, but they want to know which way he went so they could pull CCTV footage from that area. They want to narrow this down, otherwise they will be spending hours upon hours scouring through a number of videos. Time is of the essence. They have a violent killer on the loose who's likely to strike again or get away with this. The next step was to look at more CCTV footage from the areas around the park and the surrounding buildings and businesses, and then to keep moving outward until they found something. They knew very little about the killer's physical appearance, but they were going to try very hard to locate anyone who was in that location on the night that this happened and went through that park. Then, there was this other officer who was dedicated to combing through that park footage. It took him 7 days, but he finally noticed something. It actually ended up being one of the biggest breaks in this entire case. Yet it was something that everyone else missed, except for him. Moments after the killer walked off camera, there was a flash of light that peeked through the darkness. The flash appeared to be coming from an object the killer was holding. Could it be a phone? They weren't sure. You might be wondering why this is important. Well, because now they know what direction he was leaving the park. That, coupled with the time frame they have, allows them to focus on the cameras in that direction, in that area, which appeared to be an entrance off of Pegler Square. The investigators scour CCTV footage from stores and businesses in that area, looking for anyone coming and going around the time before and after the attack. A lot of work went into this. Detectives did hundreds and hundreds of hours piecing so much together to connect all the dots and catch a killer. On one of the cameras, they see a car arrive at Pegler Square at 7:41 p. That same night, so about 50 minutes before Sabina had even left her apartment. I'm going to show it to you on this map how close it was to the park. It's just across the street, and the car was around this area right here. It pulls in and parallel parks. It's the proximity to the park that makes this car stand out. However, I learned that London has ANPR cameras on all their roadways. ANPR is short for automatic number plate recognition. So as drivers make their way around town, their license plate is recorded, which I think is pretty cool. Investigators go and pull all this footage and records from the nearest ANPR camera, but it's just their luck that it was not working properly that night, so it did not record this vehicle's license plate number. That has to be so frustrating, because just when you think you have this big lead, you have nothing. But at least they could see this car. It was a light color, maybe beige, silver, or white, and there were enough characteristics to know it was a Nissan. So they have a Nissan expert come in, take a look at the footage, and they're able to determine, from the tires, the rims, the headlight style, the make, model, and the year of the vehicle, that it was a newer Nissan Micra, only about a year old. Meanwhile, another camera picked up something else that investigators believed was very relevant to this case. They think it could be an image of the killer after he fled the scene. It's footage from Pegler Square, right after the attack. The video shows a balding man who looked like he had a lighter complexion, wearing a black hoodie, light-colored pants, and black shoes with a thick white sole. He's also carrying something peculiar in his hands, and it appears to be a red object. As he walks into frame, he's looking around him and behind him as though he's checking to make sure no one's around, and then he pulls his hood up over his head. Kind of exactly what the killer did on camera when he was leaving the park. Several minutes later, another camera in this vicinity picked up the same man as he got into that vehicle that I showed you, the one parked on the side of the road, and then he sped away from the area. At this point, the police released still shots of this man and the car driving away. They confirm it's a silver Nissan Micra, and they asked the public for tips. Detective Chief Superintendent Trevor Ellery held a press conference about a week after Sabina was murdered. It was on September 23rd, right outside the park, where her body was found. By now, the news of Sabina's murder had spread, and the public was outraged. They wanted answers. Detective Ellery was pleading with the public to come forward if they were in the area that Friday night and saw anything. He said, "Sabina, we believe, was walking from her home address. Her journey would have seen her walk through Cator Park, and we believe as she walked through the park she was approached by an individual and fatally attacked. Sabina's body was sadly found by members of the public around 5:30 p.m. the following day. As anyone who lives here will know, Cator Park is well used by the community, and we're appealing for anyone who was here on Friday evening and who thinks they saw anything unusual to come forward. Maybe you saw someone acting strangely inside the park or running away from it. If you were in the area, please think back and let us know if you have any information. You will see that we have an extensive crime scene in place, and we expect it to be here for the next couple of days." It wasn't just the brutal circumstances of Sabina's death that came as a shock to this community. Sabina's murder came just a few months after another young woman named Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old marketing executive, was killed by Wayne Cousins, an off-duty police officer who had falsely arrested her for pretending that she had breached COVID-19 regulations. Instead of bringing her to the station, he drove her 80 miles away, forced himself upon her, strangled her to death, and then later burned her body and disposed of her remains in a nearby pond. Sarah's death had made headline news both nationally and internationally due to the fact that she was simply walking along the street, minding her own business when she was killed. There was a significant group of citizens who were outspoken about the lack of safety for women and girls in London. When Sarah was killed, an organization called Reclaim These Streets was formed to hold a vigil for her and all women affected by male violence. They called for social change. Women should not be afraid to walk alone. They should be allowed to be free to walk the streets without being in fear for their lives. But as most women know, the real reality is, we are afraid. We're taught to be cautious, not to wear anything revealing, to travel in groups, all because men want us for their pleasure and then want to kill us and discard us like trash when they're finished with us, just like so many other women. Women like Sarah and now Sabina and countless others. Another aspect of Sabina's case that bothered her family and the public was that her murder did not attract the same media attention as Sarah's. There was definitely a disparity in the media coverage, and some people claimed it was because Sabina wasn't white, like Sarah was. I have to tell you, there is some truth to this. Missing white woman syndrome is real. It's the media's bias against missing people of color. They just do not get the same amount of media coverage, and therefore their cases are not talked about as much or even known at all. The syndrome also encompasses a disproportionate media attention to females who are young, attractive, white, and upper middle class. It had been a week, and social media was finally starting to react to Sabina's murder, with some people wondering why they were just now becoming aware of such a brutal killing of yet another innocent woman. Celebrities began weighing in, with Jamila Jamil, Emma Barnett, and Tracy Ann Oberman among them. Jamila posted, "I don't want to hear more public warnings about women not walking in parks in the evening. I'm tired of women being burdened with treating the symptoms of men's violence against women. Treat the damn cause, men's violence. This is a man problem that women pay the price for." Actress Tracy Ann Oberman posted, "Let's never forget Sabina Nessa. News channels, keep the pressure on and the story up so close after Sarah Everard. We need to reclaim the streets. Women have to be safe and feel safe. Tragic and sickening. Thoughts with her family." Emma Barnett added, "Sabina Nessa, the 28-year-old school teacher killed in a park. A vigil will be held tomorrow, 6 months on from the murder of Sarah Everard. What has to change?" That vigil was held on Friday, September 24th at 7 p.m., right in Pegler Square, where that CCTV footage captured both a car and that suspicious man. It's also the location where Sabina had been planning to meet her date. Over 500 people showed up to honor Sabina and support her family. Sabina's sister Jabina spoke, breaking down in tears as she addressed the crowd. She said, "I just want to say thank you to everyone who came today to show support for my sister. We have lost an amazing, caring, beautiful sister who left this world far too early." Her husband took her side as she began to cry. She continued, "I just want to say thank you for everyone who came here to show support and respect to my sister, who we have lost. An amazing, very beautiful sister who left this world far too early. She did reach 2 next month to love her family. We had lost our sister, my parents have lost their daughter, and my girls have lost such a brilliant love and care and auntie who dearly loved her. Words cannot describe how we are feeling. This feels like we are stuck in a bad dream and can't get out of it. Remember, while all of this is going on, the killer is still out there. By now, the autopsy results had come in. Sabina's wounds were horrific. As I already told you, she was hit 34 times in the head with a blunt object. Her skull was fractured, she had several broken ribs, and her liver had sustained damage. She had also been strangled, and she was in such bad condition that it was not clear how she died. It could have been the trauma to her head or asphyxiation. So her cause of death was labeled as undetermined, but the manner of death was, of course, homicide. There were also defensive wounds to her right hand, and although there were no injuries to Sabina's private areas and no evidence of the presence of anyone else's bodily fluids, the removal of her tights and underwear, the way in which her outer clothing was moved, and how she was positioned all pointed to her being violated. The pressure was on to find her killer. Investigators decided to gather all ANPR records for Nissan Micras that passed within a 2-meter radius of the crime scene on the night of Sabina's murder, and between the time the killer left the park and about 2 hours before. There were hundreds of owners that needed to be looked into. After about 60 had been ruled out, one particular vehicle stood out, not just because it was a newer silver Nissan Micra, but because it wasn't usually in this area ever. The ANPR records show how many times a license plate has ever been recorded traveling into a specific area, and this Nissan Micra had been purchased and registered in the last year or so in a town called Eastbourne, which is about an hour and a half away from Kidbrooke. It's a seaside town in East Sussex, England, and the only time this vehicle had ever traveled to London was on the day of Sabina's murder. I mean, that would definitely stand out. It's like they came there just to kill her. So, who was this person, and why would they target her? Investigators didn't know the why, but now they knew the who. The owner of that car was a 36-year-old man named Koci Selamaj. They ran a simple background check on him, and they learned he had no prior convictions. So naturally they were perplexed. They wondered if this guy had anything to do with this crime, or if it was just his car that was used to commit it. It seems unusual that a person with no criminal record would commit such a heinous murder. But remember, just because there's no record doesn't mean they haven't committed a crime. Maybe they just haven't gotten caught yet. And now, once again, they needed to backtrack to find out what Koci was doing in the days leading up to Sabina's murder and who he was. So they did a little more digging. Koci was born in Elbasan, Albania, to his father Bashkim and his mother Tefta, and he spent his childhood in one of the poorest parts of Elbasan. The apartment they lived in was small, and it was located at the top of a crumbling set of stairs in an old 5-story building. Koci's neighbors remember him as a nice boy that used to play with other children when he was growing up. There really are no jobs available in this area, so the unemployment rate is very high and many residents are impoverished. To make ends meet, they usually resort to selling homegrown vegetables, secondhand clothing, or other odds and ends as street vendors. But since many people in this community can't afford food and clothing, it's not a booming business. It's a very sad situation. Koci's father was lucky enough to be able to work as a builder and brought in some extra money, while Koci's mother stayed home to raise him, his older brother, and 2 sisters. Her family were cattle farmers, and they lived in the countryside in a very remote part of Albania. The Selamaj family was known to their community, and Koci's parents were considered to be good, respectable people. Koci's father knew they were very poor and that there were no opportunities for young men where they lived, so he had high hopes that his sons would find opportunities elsewhere. So, 20 years earlier, in 2001, Koci, who had dropped out of high school, was 16 years old, and he left Albania with his older brother. By 2015, 30-year-old Koci had other plans, and that is when he immigrated to England. However, his move to the UK wasn't for the same noble reasons as Sabina's parents. He came there illegally. Koci paid someone to transport him to England, hidden in the back of a truck. He arrived in the seaside city of Eastbourne and began establishing himself by starting to work odd jobs here and there. Ultimately, he found a job at ES Car Wash during the day and delivered pizzas for Domino's at night so he could get ahead. His co-workers said that he was very ambitious. He wanted to do better in life, especially because he had met a Romanian woman in 2007 who was 9 years older than him, and he wanted to settle down. Her name is Ionela, and she's a European national. The two began dating, even though it seemed like they were a bit mismatched, not just because of the age gap, but neither one of them practiced the same religion or spoke each other's languages. Koci was Muslim and Ionela was Christian. He wasn't religious, but she was. However, both of them knew enough Italian to be able to communicate with one another, and those who knew them said they were truly in love. There were pictures on Ionela's Facebook page that included a photo of them smiling together with the caption saying, "London with my lover, forever together." Another picture shows them in Brighton. Koci is dressed nicely in a dark suit and tie, and Ionela is wearing a strapless turquoise dress. They look very happy together, just an ordinary couple. It wasn't just a relationship of convenience and let's say Koci to stay in the UK because she was a citizen of the European Union. She was allowed to live in the country legally while Koci was still in the country illegally. But as luck would have it, just before Brexit was signed into law, the government announced that spouses of EU citizens would be allowed to stay in the country legally and permanently. So, it does make you wonder, did Koci want to marry her to stay? But instead, it seemed like they were genuinely in love. Friends said they were very affectionate with one another, and by November 5th of 2018, on Bonfire Night, they were married at City Hall among a group of their friends. Bonfire Night is celebrated across the UK. There are fireworks, bonfires, sparklers, and toffee apples. The reason they do this is because it's the anniversary of a failed attempt to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So, after getting married, the couple moved into an apartment above the shops on the High Street in Eastbourne. Ionela ended up getting a job as a part-time belly dancer and as a maid in a nearby hotel, while Koci switched to working as a gas station attendant so that he could save more money for a better apartment. He told his friends that marrying Ionela was the best thing that ever happened to him. Koci still went back to Albania to see his family every now and then. His last trip home was in September of 2020. With everything, investigators pulled up on Koci from the background check, interviewing co-workers, friends, and even people from his old town. They wondered, was this really the guy they were looking for? What reason would he have to murder Sabina? It really wasn't making sense. There were no known connections between them at all. However, Koci did look like the man that they saw on the footage holding up that red item in his hand in Pegler Square on the night of the murder. And he drove the exact same car that was spotted there. I mean, he is either the most unlucky man alive at this very moment, or he was involved. Remember that they're still backtracking his steps, and as they gather more APR data from tracking the Nissan, they see that he had been at the Grand Hotel in Eastbourne on the same day of Sabina's murder, Friday, September 17th. This hotel is only a 5-minute drive from Koci's home, so they wonder what business he would have over there, since they didn't think he would need or even be able to stay in a place like that. If you're not familiar, this is a very luxurious oceanside hotel. The name says it all. It's grand, it's extravagant, it's an ivory tower after tower of rooms, and inside it's just gorgeous. It looks like royalty would live there. It's around £325 a night, which is roughly $420. So this is a really nice hotel, one that you would stay at for a special occasion unless you're very wealthy. So, what was the occasion? Well, here's where things get interesting. Police contacted the hotel to inquire about whether they had a record of Koci being there as a guest, and they said yes. The staff explained that Koci had come into the hotel on Tuesday, September 14th, and asked to pre-book a room for Friday, the 17th. Well, since it was so last minute, they only had one room still available, and it was even more costly than usual. But he said he didn't care. He was very determined to get this room. He worked at a gas station for minimum wage, so this was well outside his standard of living. Investigators wondered what this hotel would have to do with the murder, since it's over an hour and a half away from Kidbrooke. Well, that's when the staff explained they had an issue with Koci. When he came in to check in on Friday, they ended up calling Sussex Police's non-emergency line to report an incident. At around 1:15 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Koci arrived in the lobby to check into his room. This was captured on video. You can see him in the bottom left of the screen. He comes through the door carrying a duffel bag and makes his way to the front desk. During check-in, he becomes irate. He's yelling at the staff when they ask him for his credit card to prepay for the room. He said, "You already have my banking details. Why do I need to pay before I've even stayed?" He was causing a scene and making the staff uneasy, but it wasn't just because he was being difficult. It was because some of them knew who he was. Yeah, his estranged wife worked at this hotel as a housekeeper. Estranged wife? Koci and Ionella had split up a month before this, in August. Ionella decided to move out due to things not working out between them anymore. The staff was well aware that they were not on the best of terms, so it struck them as very odd that he was trying to check into a room at the hotel where she worked. It was a red flag. They knew he lived close by and that he didn't need a place to stay, so they weren't quite sure what he would be doing there. Something just didn't feel right about the situation. They figured that he most likely wanted to impress her, a last-ditch effort to try to get her to take him back, to show her that he could afford to give her the nicer things in life. Instead of being an employee, she would be an honored guest that night. But it didn't work out. About an hour after he settled in, he messaged Ionella on WhatsApp from his room on the 3rd floor while she was working on the floor below him. She had no idea at this time that he was staying at the hotel because she was busy working and was not notified about it yet. He asked her to meet him in the parking lot just to have a chat, without mentioning that he had just checked in at the same hotel she was working at. She thought that he had just driven over to her work to talk about their relationship, and at this point, they had been broken up for about 6 weeks. He had made a number of attempts to try to get her back at this point. He appeared desperate, and it did seem like it had something to do with his citizenship and also his pride. The truth was, Ionella wasn't interested in getting back together, but she hoped if they talked one final time, he would get the closure he needed and get the message that she was done. Then maybe he would finally leave her alone. Many people in similar situations as Ionella feel the exact same way. They hope that they'll be able to get through to this person that they once loved if they just try hard enough. But people like Koci cannot be convinced, and no amount of persuasion is going to change their mind. They feel entitled to control and dominate their partners, they liken them to possessions, and they believe they have ownership over them. This sense of entitlement is often reinforced by their inability to empathize with others, all of which makes it nearly impossible for them to recognize or accept that their actions are unwanted and invasive. If they can't accept that what they're doing is wrong, then they definitely won't be able to accept that someone wouldn't want them to do it to them anymore. But in this case, Ionella decided to acquiesce. She met him outside the hotel in the parking lot. He wanted to talk inside his car, which was parked outside, and he got in the driver's seat while she got in the passenger side, and they began their chat. But midway through the conversation, Koci was convinced that in order to make everything right between them, all they had to do was just have sex, because maybe being intimate would remind Ionella of what they had, their bond. So he suggested that they get into his back seat, and he climbed back there and tried to convince her to join him. But Ionella felt tricked. It made her feel disgusted that it seemed like all he wanted to do was sleep with her. The thought of having sex with him was appalling. At this point, she realized that this whole conversation was pointless, and she knew in that moment he was never going to change. She did not want to take him back, so she left without speaking another word to him. When she got back into the hotel, that is when her boss informed her about the altercation in the lobby earlier that day, and that Koci was actually booked into a room there. This made her very uneasy. She explained that he appeared very agitated when they met in the parking lot. She wasn't sure what was bothering him, but he was acting strange from the moment they met up. This is when Sussex police were contacted. It was around 4:40 p.m. A hotel staff member said they wanted to report an unruly guest and explained that there had been a disagreement between Koci Selamaj and the reception desk at the hotel, and that initially it was in regard to him not wanting to pay for his room. In addition, Ionella explained everything that I just told you, that her estranged husband was staying at the hotel, and it made her feel uncomfortable. It was clear Koci wasn't there for a luxurious getaway. He was there for her. He knew the only place that he could access Ionella without her being able to escape or get away from him in any way was at work, because she wasn't going to risk her job. The staff went on to explain to police that he had been hanging around the lobby pretending to read a newspaper or look at tourist pamphlets. However, he was actually watching and waiting for Ionella. It wasn't just Ionella who felt uneasy. Koci would leer at other women who walked through the lobby, staring them up and down without trying to hide it. His behavior made both the staff and guests at the hotel very uncomfortable. But no matter how many times they told him to please stop, he would come back and do it again. Now things are starting to come together, sort of. At least they now know that things were not good in the marriage between Ionella and Koci. Even though Koci was creating a sense of unease at the hotel, he wasn't technically doing anything illegal. As a result, the police considered the altercation resolved and did not send an officer to the hotel. Things seemed to be okay after this, because Ionella saw Koci drive off in his Nissan away from the premises and figured that maybe he would just go home and not come back. However, when the police traced where his vehicle went next, through cell phone data and ANPR records, they found that around 5 p.m. he drove to Brighton. Now, recall the picture and caption on Ionella's Facebook profile mentioning a date in Brighton. Perhaps this was his way of reminiscing about the good times, or maybe it was something much more sinister. Brighton is 30 miles away, and he was just driving up and down the streets aimlessly, back and forth, as if he were stalking someone, waiting for someone, or targeting them. But who? Presumably a victim. To investigators, it seemed like Koci had decided he needed to satisfy his craving for sex. Ionella had rejected his advances, so he was determined to find someone who couldn't say no. Was he looking for someone specific, or was he just randomly scouting for a potential victim? A woman alone, unsuspecting, whom he could take advantage of. Notably, this area was mostly residential, but there were also some parks and green spaces where someone could hide, as well as the University of Brighton nearby. Perhaps he was prowling for a university student, which is terrifying. The dormitory buildings are easily accessible, located right off the main road, with dense woods behind them. But maybe it was too bright outside at the time, with too many people around, for him to carry out an attack. Instead, it seems like he decided to increase his odds, so he headed to London, a city with a population of 10 million. London was another place where he and Ayanella had posed for a picture, which she had posted on Facebook during happier times. Was this a coincidence? Who knows? Maybe these were the only places he had ever been. We don't know. But for whatever reason, he targeted the South London area of Kidbrooke, an hour and a half away. He arrived in the area around 7:41 p.m., with his car captured on traffic cameras entering town. Minutes later, his car pulled into Pegler Square, where it was first spotted during the investigation. Next, the investigators located CCTV footage from nearby businesses that were open at the time. They caught a glimpse of him entering the Sainsbury's supermarket at 7:46 p.m., just 200 feet away from where he parked. At this point, innocent Sabina was getting ready at her apartment, just streets away from where this man was planning his attack. How do we know that's what he was doing? I think it's obvious, just by his prowling behavior. But it gets even more morbid. The interior CCTV caught Koci in the kitchenware aisle, clearly on a mission to pick out a weapon to aid him in this quest to render an unsuspecting woman unconscious so he could have his way with her. He looked at all the options, literally scratching his head, wondering what he should choose. Finally, he grabbed a rolling pin, something you'd usually use to roll dough, and slapped it in his hand, testing its force. But then he put it back and continued down the aisle, still looking. Moments later, he came back, retrieved the rolling pin again, feeling it to see if it would do. He took a few last looks around before grabbing an energy drink and chili powder, then checked out with these 3 items and a bag. The evidence even showed that he used his bank card at the store. He didn't even bother to use cash. Investigators believe these were pretty odd items to buy together, but maybe he was going to throw the pepper in someone's face. The energy drink? Well, he's about to attack someone, so I guess that made sense. He needs a little extra energy. We're watching someone plan a murder. Just remember that as he's walking down these aisles, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And it actually makes me sick thinking about how calm and collected he is. Like this was just an ordinary shopping trip. He goes back to his car, opens the trunk to retrieve his hoodie, and that's when he sees something better inside. He leaves the rolling pin in the trunk and pulls out a traffic triangle from the bottom of that trunk area. It's one of those emergency reflective traffic triangles used to alert other drivers that they're approaching an unexpected stationary vehicle. A common piece of road safety equipment found in most vehicles in the UK. Now you might be a little confused because wouldn't it be obvious? Well, when these are unfolded and set up, they form a 3D triangle, and they're pretty sizable. The base is typically weighted or stabilized to ensure it remains upright, but they come packaged in a flat, compact shape. If you're watching, they're folded down into a straight line about 2 feet in length, and they have a bit of weight to them, 4 pounds to be exact. Definitely heavier than that rolling pin, and they're made of metal. He kept it folded, that's what was in his hand, causing the glimmer in the park at night, and that was what was captured on CCTV in Pegler Square when he returned with it in his hands. It's red. Now, his choice to grab the triangle instead of going with a rolling pin ultimately gave him away. At 8:08 p.m., he enters the park, a whole 22 minutes before the attack. He's seen on camera just walking around, looking for a victim. He's a predator looking for prey. He's got his hood up over his head, and he's hiding and waiting for a woman walking alone. That's when he sees Sabina, and you know the rest. He hit her 34 times with this hard, rigid metal traffic triangle with such force that it began to unfold. He continued hitting her with it until part of it broke. Then he left the park just before 9 p.m., walked back to his car, put the triangle in his trunk, and then drove away to Eastbourne, back to the Grand Hotel, like nothing happened. He's seen on lobby footage 4 minutes after midnight, returning with his duffel bag and heading to his room. They got him. He had the same sweatshirt and black shoes with the white SES on them during check-in at the lobby, at the supermarket, and in the footage in Pegler Square. It's him, it's obvious it's him. But now they have to prove it with enough evidence. He killed an innocent woman because he was rejected by his estranged wife and wanted to pleasure himself and take his anger out. Koci checked out of his hotel the next day. He went to work like nothing happened, and for 9 days he acted normal. He thought he got away with it. He thought he planned well, a faraway place, an alibi at the hotel, even his wife saw him. He took Sabina's clothing, wiped down the bench. But sir, you forgot you had a digital footprint. Police showed up at Koci's apartment in the early morning hours of September 26th with an arrest warrant, and they took him into custody. Once in custody, suspects are allowed to be held for 24 hours until police have enough evidence to keep them longer. Then it can be extended to 36, 48, and then 96 hours if police have the authority. There was a lot of pressure for them to find the murder weapon, the clothing he was wearing, and most of all, Sabina's DNA. But with all the time that had passed, they didn't expect to find any of that. When they searched his apartment, they located the exact black Skechers sneakers with a thick white sole and the sweatsuit he wore on the night of the murder. It was actually in the dryer. It had already gone through a wash cycle, but at least they had it to compare to the footage. But they had something better. Sabina's blood was found on the sneakers, a very tiny droplet on the sole that Koci probably didn't think was still there. They also located the rolling pin in his trunk, but they still couldn't locate the weapon or Sabina's missing clothing. Detectives got in touch with Ianella, and she was interviewed. She explained that she had no idea that Koci was being tracked by police. She said she came by the apartment the night before to retrieve some things and possibly talk to him about their breakup, but she told police that when she saw him, his face was different. He hardly wanted to talk to her, wouldn't let her inside, and she noticed he was wearing new shoes. Now, he didn't have a lot of money to spend on things like that. That was a luxury for him, so it was definitely something noticeable that he had a brand new pair of shoes. You would think he would throw the other pair away. Maybe he just hadn't gotten to it yet. But now, it was her turn to speak to detectives about what she knew. Ianella told them that after they were married, things changed, and she experienced his increasingly erratic behavior firsthand. Things had gotten even worse in the last year when Koci began pressuring her to move to London. But at the time, he was delivering pizzas, and she didn't think they could afford to move, so she refused. That's when he changed. He became cold, aggressive, and then violent. Neighbors even recalled hearing loud arguments when they first moved in, but over the next few months it got worse. He had strangled her on 3 separate occasions. The first time was when Ianella didn't answer one of his calls. He just began yelling at her, saying, "Why didn't you answer your phone?" She said she was just in bed and was shocked when he came at her. But then he snapped out of it and let her go, though he never apologized. And the next time was when he found out that she had spoken to an ex of hers. The final time he tried to hurt her was when she came home from work and brought him home some food that she knew he liked. Instead of being thankful, he was dismissive and aggressive, and she didn't know why. She didn't know why he was treating her so badly. She felt like he hated her. They weren't sleeping in the same bed anymore. They weren't eating together in the house. And later, when he returned from his late shift at work, he didn't say a word. He just ran at her, put his hands around her neck, and started to choke her. She thought she was going to die. He throttled her to the point where she would almost pass out, or actually pass out, and then he would let her come to. For some reason, he stopped before ever killing her. The last time he did this was in August, when she finally decided she wanted to leave him for good. She was so scared she stayed with him out of fear, and she said she didn't go to the police because she didn't think they would believe her, as she had no visible marks, no bruises, no witnesses. Now, she feels lucky to be alive, but is struggling to come to terms with feelings of guilt for not having done something to stop him so he wouldn't hurt someone else. She didn't understand why he would choose an innocent girl. She never thought he would reach the point where he would be capable of murder. Physical violence, yes, but killing someone, no. She said that she had little to no contact with him for the past 6 weeks until he asked her to meet him on September 17th. When she met with him, she said he was very anxious and impatient. She had never seen him like that before. She also noticed a bottle of alcohol in his car and could smell it on his breath. He wasn't drunk at the time, but he was acting very strangely. It's all beginning to make a lot more sense now. As investigators were finalizing their evidence to present to the prosecution, they realized something. While examining the route he took back home from Kidbrooke after the murder, they discovered 8 unaccounted minutes and realized that he had gone off course. He took a detour on a country road in Tonbridge Wells, close to the River Tees. When he passed a farmhouse in that area, his car was actually caught on camera. Investigators realized he most likely stopped here to throw evidence into the river. So, they got divers out there, along with the Kent Fire and Rescue Service, to help them search around Dundale Road. They wanted to find anything within throwing distance in the water. Using magnets to search the riverbed, they eventually got a hit. They found the traffic triangle. This is excellent detective work. They already had him, but this added more evidence to solidify the conviction. Upon his arrest, he was provided with a translator because he didn't speak English very well. Investigators pressed him to tell them why he did this, but he wouldn't say a word. He was calm, collected, and unwilling to talk. And while I don't know the laws there, here it's your right to remain silent. Nevertheless, he denied any involvement in Sabina's death and refused to answer their questions. At that time, he wasn't officially charged yet, so they couldn't leverage anything to get a confession. But once he was in his cell, they saw him with his head in his hands, pacing up and down. They believed at that point what he had done was finally beginning to sink in. On September 27th, the Crown prosecution presented all their evidence, and he was charged with murder. He put his head in his hands, and it seemed like he wanted to make a deal. Through his interpreter, he asked, "What will happen to me if I open up now and say everything?" But he was cautioned not to speak. His defense attorney informed the court that his client planned to plead not guilty at the preliminary hearing on September 30th, which he did. There's much more to tell about what he did, what he said, what he admitted, and what he didn't. But before I continue, I really want to touch on the second vigil. They put on a second candlelight vigil for Sabina on October 5th, following Koci's arrest. This time, to make a bold statement, hundreds of people gathered in Eastbourne, where the killer resided. In attendance was his estranged wife, Ionella. She was seen bawling in the middle of the crowd, muttering under her breath through tears that it should have been her. It should have been her that was dead, not Sabina. Kind people around her comforted her, and when they realized who it was, one woman allowed her to sob on her shoulder and kept hugging her. Ionella just kept saying she doesn't understand what Koci had against Sabina, and that it would have made much more sense if he had killed her, not Sabina. She held a lot of guilt for not doing more when she had the chance, and she was so ashamed to be the wife of a killer that she could barely make it out her front door. Eventually, she moved back to Romania. Then, on October 23rd, which would have been Sabina's 29th birthday, her family got together and released balloons to celebrate her life. Everyone in attendance was given packets of sunflower seeds to plant because that was Sabina's favorite flower. Her sister Sabina said they're bright and they stand up tall, just like Sabina. She also said that since what happened, she now has to think twice about going out, and it's changed her perspective on everything, mentioning that she finds the pain of Sabina's death unbearable. She said, "People say I'm so sorry for your loss and that time is a healer, but it's not. It's a load of rubbish. It gets no easier. I want her to walk in the door, but it's never going to happen again." To honor Sabina, plans were made to design a garden in her name, where the children from her school can remember her. They also wanted to create a positive association with green spaces like parks and gardens, so that these children won't associate them with their teacher's death and be fearful of such spaces. Lisa Williams, the head teacher, said, "I know very much she would have wanted her children not to be tainted by this. She was young, she was beautiful, and she was an optimist. She would have wanted her children to be full of life and ambition and to support them to get through it. However, she also pointed out that they would need to talk to the children about safety and how to spot danger and all the other important things that will hopefully protect them from harm. That's not going to be easy. They're so young, and they should be able to be free to play outdoors with their friends and not think about danger. But that, unfortunately, is the world that we live in. It's not always safe, which is truly sad. Now, let me tell you what transpired at the next hearing on December 16th. At this point, Koci admitted to rendering Sabina unconscious, but said that he did not kill her. It appeared that he was planning to use a mental health defense, but the prosecution was one step ahead of him. They were like, nope, that's not gonna fly, not with all the planning that went into this crime. By January 27th, Koci's attorney said that he does not dispute that he is responsible for killing Sabina. He doesn't dispute the facts of the case presented by the prosecution, except that it was sexually motivated. Yeah, he was having a really hard time admitting that part. I wonder why he admitted that he was the attacker, but he made it clear that he did not accept that they were saying he removed some of her clothing, that he raised her skirt up, or that she was exposed. Okay, so how did those things happen if it wasn't him? Was it some kind of second perpetrator just walking by the scene and coming upon her in the bushes? He never elaborated on why he would have even attacked Sabina to begin with. The trial was then set for June of 2022, but on February 14th the defense indicated that Koci would finally be pleading guilty to murder at the hearing on the 25th of February, and that is what he did. His sentencing was scheduled for April 8th, and guess what? He decided he didn't want to show his face. He decided he didn't want to show his face. He didn't want to show up for Sabina's family and all the other people that he knew would be staring him down, so he remained in his jail cell like the coward that he is. Sabina's family members gave very moving victim impact statements, with Sabina saying that Koci is an awful human being and doesn't deserve his name to be said, that he's a disgusting animal. Her family added that Sabina had every right to be walking through the park, all glammed up and going to enjoy herself after a long week at work. Her parents said that he had no right to take her away from them in such a cruel way, and that Koci robbed her and them of her life. They wanted it to be known that she was an amazing role model who defied all norms. She strove to be independent and was powerful, fearless, bright, and an amazing soul. She died in a way that no one should, and that will torment them all and Sabina's friends for the rest of their lives. Now it was time for both sides, the prosecution and defense, to argue what the sentence should be, with the defense bringing in any mitigating factors. There were some legal mitigating factors. Maybe we wouldn't agree that they should be mitigating, but the fact that he had no criminal record, for example, is a real legal way to mitigate. This was his first offense, per se, that they know about at least, and of course his upbringing and things like that. But when they were finished, the judge stated that in the absence of any explanation from Mr. Koci about why he attacked Sabina, he was going to defer to the prosecution's argument that it was sexually motivated, especially with all of the evidence, at which point the defense attorney said that their client offered no challenge to the prosecution's case. So essentially, he accepts it. He accepts that he attacked her, he killed her, and it was sexually motivated, but he still would not provide any details or explanation for his actions. His defense ended with the statement that their client simply accepted that he had done it and noted that Koci had given him no instructions to express any remorse on his behalf, which goes to show you how heartless he really is. And of course, as can be expected, the sentencing did not bring Sabina's family any closure, other than knowing that Koci would be behind bars. The judge ultimately sentenced him to a minimum of 36 years in prison, but I gotta say that's all. Because even though he's been deemed dangerous and did this heinous attack on someone, he still has a chance at parole in his 70s. But I gotta tell you, he's probably never going to get out because within a year, he attacked 2 prison guards. They came to investigate some commotion in his cell, and he brutally attacked one of them with a piece of porcelain that broke off the toilet. He actually managed to stab that officer in the right thigh and in the arm before more staff members came to subdue him. Then that's when he punched another officer in the face, adding more time to his sentence and, of course, again showing how dangerous this man really is. While in prison, Koci's 73-year-old dad Bashkim and his sister Galanda tried to visit him multiple times. His dad even begged him to tell him why he killed Sabina, but Koci refused to leave his cell and meet with them. His father spoke to the media and said, "Koci has a strong character, but now he's realizing what he has done, and it's shameful. That shame stops him from meeting with his family." He actually cut his family off completely, but his dad still tried to make contact with him, saying that he'd like to know from Koci himself why he did it, adding that the murder of Sabina caused a huge tragedy to her family, and that he still cannot believe that his son was involved. And that it also caused a tragedy for their family as well. He explained that he's an older man, suffering from several illnesses after a head operation several years ago. Though he knows his son is a killer, he'd at least like to see him before he dies. The same goes for his mom, who's 70. He said he feels pain for Sabina losing her life, but he also has lost his son. He tried visiting, writing letters, and still received no response. He doesn't wish this on anyone. He wanted to make that clear. He never had any problems with Koci as a child and doesn't understand how he could do this to someone he didn't even know. Hit them in the head 34 times. He let the public know that they were so sad for Sabina, that she was a human being who did not deserve to die that way. He also wanted to apologize to Sina's family, but unfortunately he could not get the courage to face them. He told the Sunday Mirror that he and his daughter really wanted to apologize to Sabina's family for what Koci did, but he just didn't have the courage to come face to face with them. He has 2 daughters himself, and he understands what it would be like to lose one. To be fair, his son left home when he was only 16, so maybe he hadn't turned into the monster that he would later become. But I do feel bad for both of these families. I, of course, have to feel more pain for Sabina's family because Koci had a choice. Sabina didn't. She didn't choose to be murdered. She wanted to make a difference. And even though it's in such a tragic way, she is because her story highlights this epidemic of violence towards women and girls. She lives on in all of us, and every single time we tell her story, in every single person who gets to know her by watching videos like this. I want to end with words from Sabina. She says she hopes for a cultural shift that challenges the conditions in which boys and men are taught that girls and women are inferior and undeserving of respect and protection. She said, "If I can do something from what we've experienced as a family to bring some sort of change, then I will. It will be Sabina's legacy. I want women to be able to walk the streets alone any time of the day." 2 high school seniors, eager to savor the final days of summer, set out for a field party to meet friends. Tragically, they would never arrive. This chilling story reveals how a single wrong turn can lead to devastating consequences. Today I'm taking you to a place that I've never talked about before, Ozark, Alabama. In Ozark, Alabama, life unfolds at a gentle southern pace. Sunny days melt into nights with fireflies twinkling. It's a very tight-knit community with oak-lined streets filled with the memories of generations that came before, where friendly faces greet you from porch swings, swaying in the warm breeze. You can smell the hickory smoke from the backyard barbecues mingling with the scent of honeysuckle vines that wrap around weathered fences. The mornings start with roosters crowing and boots hitting the pavement as neighbors head to their local diner, where sweet tea refills are endless and the gossip is thicker than the grits. Evenings are for Friday night football under the stadium lights, cheering for the Wildcats. In Ozark, life is simple, and the sense of belonging is warm and comforting, because you're not just a resident, you're part of the fabric of a town where everyone knows your name and welcomes you with a smile. It's supposed to be in a fictional town in rural Alabama, but Ozark isn't that rural. Parts of it are. There's a similar town close by called Dothan, about 30 minutes away, and that is where the first person that I'm going to introduce you to was born. Her name is Tracy Jean Hollett. She was born in Dothan, Alabama on March 3, 1982. She's the only child of Carol and Robert Hollett, who went by Bob. He's a Vietnam veteran who served in the Marines and was also well-liked as a Dothan police corporal. Sadly, tragedy struck when Tracy was just under 5 years old. In January of 1987, just 6 weeks before Tracy's birthday, Bob actually drowned on a lake while he was on a fishing trip. As you can imagine, his unexpected death would be hard on Tracy and her mother. Later, Carol eventually remarried a man named Mike Roberts, and they had 2 sons together, Benjamin and Christopher. Mike treated Tracy like his own daughter, and the family was very active in their church. In fact, Tracy's life centered around Heritage Baptist Church, where she actively participated in their youth group and was involved in their Sunday school program. She even went on to teach at Vacation Bible School. Tracy was well known for her loving and giving nature. She got along well with her parents, and especially bonded with her mom. Even as a teenager, she didn't argue with her parents, and she willingly spent time with her younger brothers. She would take them on car rides with the convertible top down and the music blaring. Tracy excelled academically, consistently making the honor roll throughout elementary, middle, and high school. She attended Northview High School, where she was a majorette and part of the yearbook staff. Outside of school, Tracy had a passion for pursuing a career as a missionary doctor after experiencing a life-altering mission trip to Texas while she was participating at church. During this experience, Tracy realized her true calling was to make a difference in the lives of others. She experienced firsthand the limited access to health care, and she wanted to help underserved communities. In the meantime, Tracy worked at a J.C. Penney store in the men's department, and she took on babysitting jobs for families in her neighborhood. Growing up, Tracy was very close to her 2 younger brothers, as I mentioned, and she would be seen walking them to various activities. Tracy was also very close with her mother. The bond they shared was special, going beyond the normal parent-child relationship. She referred to her mom as her best friend. Tracy and Carol's bond was unique. They supported and cheered one another on. They laughed together and were there through thick and thin. The mother and daughter loved spending time together, whether they were shopping, having a lunch date, or just sharing a cup of coffee. Everywhere Tracy went, she stood out for her outgoing and bubbly personality. She always seemed to be smiling, and her great sense of humor made her very popular. She had a wide circle of friends, which included her best friend, J.B. Beasley, who was in the same grade as she was. Tracy and J.B.'s classmates noticed that the girls shared a lot of similarities. They were in the same church youth group and were both known for being friendly, hardworking, and outgoing. They even participated in the Miss Spectrum beauty pageant together, both earning spots in the top 10. They were beautiful on the inside and out. J.B. Hilton Green Beasley was born in Troy, Alabama on July 31, 1982, to her mom Cheryl and father Hilton Lanyard Beasley. J.B.'s unique name wasn't short for Jessica or Janet. It was nothing like that. She got her name from a combination of her dad's name, Hilton, and her dad's childhood friend's name, which is James Buford Green. J.B. didn't use the name James. She just always went by the initials J.B. She did have an older sister, Liv, who was actually 7 years her senior. Unfortunately, her father, Hilton, and her mother, Cheryl, eventually split up. Cheryl married a man named Joseph Bernard Burgoon, who, by the way, has the same initials as JB, actually JBB. This was important, at least for Cheryl and Joe, because all of their daughters had the initials JBB going forward. They went on to have 4 daughters together. In 1988, Jamie Brooke. In 1989, Jackie Bernice. In 1991, Jo Beth BRD. And in 1994, Jillian B. I tried to find her middle name, but I couldn't. However, it did start with an A, and I thought that was so cool, how even if these women go on to marry and change their last names, they will all still be JB because their first and middle names all begin with JB. All the girls were close in age to JB and grew up in Dothan. Like Tracy, JB had experienced a tragic loss in her family at a young age. In May of 1994, JB's older sister Liv passed away at only 19 years old. I tried, but I could not find out how Liv passed away. She was a graduate of Jeff Davis High School and then attended Auburn University, working at an eye doctor's office in McGarry, Alabama, when she died. Liv's death made JB the oldest sister, and she took that role very seriously. She acted as a guardian to her sisters, always looking out for them. JB's cousin, Lindsay Turner, whose mother and JB's father, Lanyard, are brother and sister and was 4 years older than JB, recalls her being kind and patient, especially with her younger sisters, who could get on her nerves sometimes. Lindsay said JB loved her sisters more than anything in the world, and she did so much for them. She babysat them quite frequently and would even prepare their lunches in the morning for school. Lindsay said JB was literally the best person that she had ever known. But she was also the typical teenager growing up in the 1990s. She was passionate about things like country music and idolized artists such as Garth Brooks, Tim McGraw, Alan Jackson, and the Dixie Chicks. Her favorite song that held a special place in her heart, though, was Angel by Sarah McLachlan. You may be able to relate to the next thing that JB was obsessed with. It was definitely a blast from the past. She loved Bath & Body Works. But her favorite scent of all time was none other than cucumber melon. She would always be wearing it, and Lindsay remembers that it was a go-to gift everyone would gift to JB for whatever the occasion. JB, her sisters, and her mom were also models. They modeled for department stores like Gayfers, Parisians, and McRae's. One particular memory they shared together was being on the runway at a Mother's Day fashion show. The sisters shared many memorable times. They loved watching the Jaws movie over and over again and singing Navy songs from the films. They loved dancing, dressing up, and giving full-blown performances. JB had an undying passion for dance. She excelled in ballet, jazz, lyrical, and tap, earning various dance trophies and awards, including All-American Cheerleader. JB's sister, Jo Beth, said that JB was made to dance. She was an angel gliding on the stage, and you could feel her passion for it when she danced. Jo Beth remembers being in awe of JB's dancing. She would watch her sister, dreaming of being like her when she got older. JB was so serious about dance that after high school, she planned to pursue it as a career. She wanted to go to Texas Christian University, where she dreamed of majoring in dance. Yet dance wasn't her only talent. She maintained a spot on the honor roll and even received a United States National Honor Roll award. She was a member of the Future Business Leaders of America. Just like Tracy, JB took her studies very seriously. She was always busy. But when she wasn't in school dancing, she was shopping, tanning, and spending time with friends and family. JB also held a job as a file clerk and a receptionist at Southern Clinic, where she was known for actually making friends with all of the patients. While JB enjoyed her job, her passion would always be dance. At some point in July 1999, she actually landed a job as a dance instructor. But sadly, she never got the chance to begin this dream role of hers. I want to take you back to Saturday, July 31st, 1999. It was JB's 17th birthday, and both she and Tracy were gearing up for their senior year of high school, which was set to start in just a few days on August 3rd. At this time, Cheryl and JB's stepdad Joe had gotten divorced, and they shared custody of the children. They would go back and forth between the two households, and on that particular weekend, the girls were over at Joe's house. They would be back over at Cheryl's on Sunday evening to celebrate JB's birthday and mark the end of summer. She and Tracy decided to attend a field party that night. The plan was for JB to spend the night at Tracy's, and then the next morning, they would go to church together before JB had to make it back home in time for her sister Jackie's 10th birthday party. JB wouldn't miss her sister's party for anything. She knew how much it meant for her to be there for Jackie. At around 10 p.m., the two 17-year-old friends left Tracy's house in JB's black 1994 Mazda 929, a gift from her father. They headed out to the field party in Headland, which was about 20 miles northeast of Dothan. I'm not sure if being teenagers meant not being able to keep track of time or consider how long it would take to get to their destination, then hang out and go all the way back to Tracy's. But she had a long-standing and strict 11:30 p.m. curfew. Back then, of course, there was no GPS, so the girls couldn't simply plug in the location and know exactly how much time it would take to go there and back. I just kept thinking, looking at the map on Google, that they weren't really going to have that much time to hang out. It would have taken them about 17, maybe 20 minutes, give or take, to get there, so technically, they would only have about an hour to hang out until they had to make it back in time for Tracy's curfew. I don't think they were planning to make it. I think they were going to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. However, they never made it to that party. They got lost on the way through the curving, winding roads. They didn't have cell phones, so they had to find a payphone to call for help. That would have to be nerve-wracking for a parent, not only not knowing where your kids were, but how would anyone know where the girls were if they even found a payphone to call? Just after 11:30 p.m., JB and Tracy saw a gas station with an attached convenience store called the Big Little. It was located at 763 East Broad Street in Ozark, Alabama, that small town I told you about, with about 15,000 people. It's roughly 23 miles northwest of their home in Dothan. I don't know how they got this far off track, but if you look on the map, Ozark is pretty much in the totally opposite direction from Headland where they were supposed to be going. When they got to the store, they planned to ask someone for directions and just use the pay phone to let Tracy's mom, Carol, know they were running late for Tracy's 11:30 curfew. When the girls arrived at the Big Little store, they found out it was closed, but there was a payphone. Tracy used it to call her mother. She told Carol that they never made it to the party because they got lost. However, there was a car pulling up at that moment. It was a mother and daughter, and they were talking to them and trying to get directions back to Dothan from where they were. Once they knew how to get back to Tracy's, she relayed this to her mother and then asked if, on the way back, she and JB could quickly stop by her boyfriend Wade's house to see him and some friends in Midland City on their way home, which would have been the halfway mark between Ozark and Dothan. Carol said okay, but you can only stay for 5 minutes since that 11:30 curfew had already passed. Tracy agreed and she said, "I love you," and hung up with her mom. When Tracy hung up, she called Wade, and they agreed to meet up at the Midland City gas station. Carol was expecting the girls to arrive back sometime after midnight, but when over an hour had passed, she started to get worried. She decided to make some phone calls to find out if she could figure out where the girls were. Now, Carol wasn't that familiar with JB's mother or stepfather, and I realize not all parents get too acquainted with one another. Maybe they know their name, their address, their phone number, the basic information. Both had daughters that they trusted, and that weekend, JB's mother didn't have the kids. She was working at a tennis shop at a country club that whole weekend. That night, she was actually not just working, but in a tennis tournament. She finished up around 10 p.m., the same time the girls would have been heading out of town and unknowingly into Ozark. After work, Cheryl stopped by a friend's house to feed his dog since he was out of town, and then around 10:30, Cheryl decided to stop at a local block party held at a popular restaurant and pub in downtown Dothan called Poplar Head. She met up with a friend, Maman, and she thought she might actually run into JB and Tracy that night. She was hoping she would so that she could say happy birthday to her daughter in person. So, all throughout the night, Cheryl kept searching the crowd, but of course, she never saw her. Since they didn't have cell phones, even if Tracy's mom had called Cheryl's house, she wouldn't have been home to receive that call. The last time she and JB talked was actually Thursday night, 2 nights before her birthday. JB was telling her about 2 different dates that she had scheduled for Friday night. Before JB left her mother's, her mom had a special birthday wish for her. She said it could be summed up with the song Forever Young by Bob Dylan. Cheryl shared with JB the lyrics of that song that deeply resonated with her, and she wanted JB to understand the importance of staying forever young at heart. She believed that JB possessed a unique youthful spirit that should never be lost. To further express her wish, Cheryl presented JB with a copy of that song. She encouraged her to listen to the lyrics and consider the message. Not only that, Cheryl mentioned how JB's dancing skills would be perfect to complement the song, and she said, "You should choreograph a routine to it." No one had any idea what Tracy and JB were going to go through the night of JB's birthday. Finally, Carol did get a hold of Wade, and what he told her made her even more concerned. He said the girls never showed up at the Midland City gas station. He and his friends waited for at least 30 minutes, but when they didn't come by, Wade and his friends left. Later that night, he tried calling Tracy at home several times to make sure she made it, but she never answered. Hours were passing with no word from the girls. Carol even began calling hospitals in the area to check if the girls were there, but they weren't. She was worried and unable to find them, so Tracy's stepdad Mike went out and looked for them. He searched parking lots, roads, all around town and beyond, but he didn't find them or JB's car. When Mike returned without any news, Carol called the Dothan Police Department to report the girls missing. It was now 8 a.m. Sunday morning, August 1st. Carol gave the police all the information about the girls, when they left, the kind of car they were driving, and that she spoke to Tracy around 11:30 p.m. the night before when the girls were at the gas station in Ozark. Meanwhile, Cheryl, JB's mom, had no idea that anything was wrong. At around 9:15 in the morning, she received a phone call from JB's dance teacher, and the teacher asked her who was responsible for JB that weekend. Cheryl thought that was kind of an odd question, and when she asked her why, the teacher just responded with, "Oh, it's nothing." This statement left Cheryl unsettled. She decided to go on with her day and head to the country club, but, because of this strange phone call, she was preoccupied with thoughts that something may be wrong with her daughter. She couldn't help feeling that something was off. As she carried on her duties at the country club, a family friend came in and approached her and informed her that JB and Tracy had not returned to Tracy's house the night before. Of course, this was even more unsettling, but maybe the girls were just having a little too much fun, and they decided to stay with friends. I know that most of us don't want to think the worst right away. Cheryl spent the next several hours trying to find out where her daughter was, having conversations with her friends, and then finally the police. She was desperate for information regarding her now missing teenager. However, no one seemed to have any knowledge of their whereabouts. But hours earlier, at 9 a.m., a patrol officer out in Ozark, who had no idea about Tracy and JB, was doing his normal rounds. That's when he noticed a black Mazda that appeared to be abandoned on the side of Herring Avenue, a narrow road that's often used by locals as a shortcut through town. This area was located less than a mile from the Big Little store. Looking at photos, I can see that Herring Avenue is surrounded by dense woods on both sides, and it looks like it would be very dark at night. So, why would the girls have stopped there? Did they run out of gas? And where were they now? The thing is, at the time when they found the Mazda, the patrol officer didn't know that this car belonged to JB or that it was connected to missing teens. So all the officer did was report the car as abandoned. Not much else could be done. About 10:30 in the morning, they were making the connection between the girls and the gas station in Ozark. Eventually, the Ozark PD became aware that the girls had made contact with Carol at that payphone off East Broad Street at the gas station. That's when they reviewed their system and saw the report of the abandoned vehicle that matched the description of the Mazda that JB was driving. Here's the exact location where the car had been found, and this is how far it is from the Big Little gas station and convenience store where they stopped to call Tracy's mom, a mere 2-minute drive. Officers went out to that location to see if maybe there were any clues as to what had happened. The car was locked. One of the windows on the driver's side was cracked just a little bit, and it appeared that the car may have been out of gas. It was very muddy, and it didn't look like the car had been forced off the road. There was no damage to the outside. When they looked inside, they saw that a purse was on the floor in front of the passenger seat. Since they couldn't get inside, they decided to break one of the windows with a baton to gain entry. Once in the car, they found JB's driver's license stuck in between the seat and the center console, and the purse had credit cards, jewelry, and cash still inside. It didn't look like they had been robbed or that anyone forced themselves into the car. The police had been given a description of JB's key ring. I don't know if you remember these from the 90s, but they were little white blocks with black letters. One of them had a heart on it and spelled out, "Hard to get." Despite doing a thorough search of the vehicle, including underneath the seats, the officers could not locate these keys. Without the keys, they couldn't get into the locked trunk of the Mazda to continue looking for clues. They even used a metal detector in the area, but they couldn't find the keys. At this point, officers from Ozark informed the Dothan Police Department that JB's car had been located, and a detective came out to the scene. Everyone was concerned about this abandoned vehicle. Besides it being linked to their disappearance, the car had some red flags. It was very dirty, like it had been taken off-road. There was mud on the rear bumper, the wheel wells, and dry sand and mud inside as well. This was concerning because there were no dirt roads nearby, just a footpath that went into the nearby woods. They also found smudge marks on one of the back doors that looked like they could be a handprint. They really wanted to find a way to open JB's trunk. They were looking for a button inside that would release the hatch. If they couldn't figure it out, they were going to call a locksmith. While all this was going on in Ozark, JB's little sister, Jackie, was back in Dothan with her dad, waiting to meet up with all of her friends for her birthday at a pool for a swimming party. Their 3 cousins had actually flown in from Japan to spend time with them before school started after the summer. They were all excited to get to the party, but Jackie noticed that her dad had been in and out of the house all morning, and he seemed to be preoccupied. She was scared that they were going to be late to her own party, but they did eventually get there, and they began having a lot of fun. However, after a while, she realized that JB had never shown up, and her dad was missing in action too. That was pretty upsetting. She also felt that something wasn't right when she finally got back home to her dad's later that afternoon. Her sisters and her cousins thought something was wrong. Their grandmother was in her room with the door closed, and they could hear her talking to someone. It sounded like a very intense conversation. Now little 7-year-old Jo Beth could even feel the tension, but no one was saying anything. However, she felt like the adults were acting kind of weird, making sure that the girls were staying busy. They had no idea that their older sister was missing. Now back in Ozark, the detectives were planning to have a tow truck come and get the vehicle and bring it back to Dothan. As officers were waiting, the detectives finally realized that they could use a button inside the car to pop the trunk. At this point it was around 2 p.m., and when they popped that trunk and the officers looked inside, they made a devastating discovery. There were both JB and Tracy's lifeless bodies lying right next to each other. This had now turned from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation because it was clear that both of the girls had been murdered. They were fully clothed with mud all over their clothing. Rigor mortis had already reached its peak and was starting to diminish. Therefore, the bodies were transitioning to the next phase when bodies go from being stiff to soft again. It was difficult for them to figure out approximately when they died. It was super hot that day. Records show it was around 100 degrees, and overnight it hadn't even dipped below 81 degrees. What happened to JB and Tracy? The police wouldn't know for sure until the bodies were removed from the trunk and taken to the medical examiner's office for autopsies. While that was being conducted, both families were being notified of this heartbreaking news. When Cheryl found out, she said that she immediately started to vomit. She could not believe that her little girl was killed on her birthday. She just kept imagining JB calling out to her in her last moments, wanting her mom by her side, and she couldn't be there to help her. The shock and despair of this entire situation overwhelmed her. Her whole world was turned upside down in a minute. In the next few hours, many of her family and friends would come to be by her side at her home to comfort her. It was around 6 p.m. when Jackie remembers hearing her grandmother scream inside of her room, and she could hear her crying. Yet still, no one had said anything to the kids. I want to read you exactly what Jackie said. She remembers about that night when her dad finally drove the girls to their mother's house. She said, "As we got close to the house, I immediately noticed the slow funeral sign sitting in the yard. My dad kept reassuring us that everything was okay, but I knew better. I asked him if my mom was dead, and he said, 'No, she's okay.' My dad walked us all into the house, and I saw my mother sitting on the floor crying with people all around her. She grabbed us all and put her arms around us. While looking at us all in the face, she said, "JB is dead." I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. Those words hit me so hard I couldn't even speak. All I remember is being silent and walking the house, waiting for her to come home any minute. The next morning, I woke up and heard the shower going, and I got up thinking it was JB. Then it hit me that she was never coming back. My world had been turned upside down, and our family was never going to be the same. She said that her last memory of JB was on Saturday morning, the day before Jackie's birthday. JB gave her a big hug and told Jackie that she would see her the next day at her party. Jackie remembers JB hugging her for a few seconds and telling her that she loved her. She said that was the last time she heard her sweet voice, and she will never forget it. JB's family had not experienced one, but now 2 of Cheryl's daughters had died just years apart. Just like that, Jamie Brooke became the oldest sister, just like JB had when Liv passed away, and now they became 4 sisters. There would be one less sister running through the house and fighting over the bathroom in the morning as they were getting ready for school. Little Job Beth was only 7, and she remembers that day that she got the news. Her older sister was gone. She said, "I remember walking into my mom's house and I saw everyone surrounding our mother and crying. That's when we got the most devastating news. Because I was so young, I didn't quite understand what was going on. I couldn't believe that I wouldn't be able to see my sister again. It was so hard to understand at that time. It would be hard for any of us to understand, but especially a young child." Then there was JB's cousin, Lindsay, who had been busy at school at Auburn University when the news came in. She was so upset that she couldn't be with her family. She said, "I wanted to stay at my parents' house until we got more news. But I had papers due early that week, so my parents insisted that I head back to Auburn and they would keep me updated." That afternoon was torture, waiting to hear anything, but I somehow managed to slap together rough drafts of my papers. When I was finished, I jumped in the shower and intended to call my parents as soon as I got out. I had just gotten dressed and was about to dry my hair when I heard a knock at the door. When I looked out the peephole, I saw my brother and sister-in-law, and I knew right then what they were about to tell me. Opening the door, the look on my brother's face was all I needed. It was like someone had kicked me in the stomach, and the pain would never stop. I had experienced numerous terrible days in my life, including a head-on collision with an 18-wheeler, but the day we lost JB is still by far the worst day of my life. Tracy's mother, Carol, and stepfather Mike received the devastating news that JB and Tracy had been found, but tragically they were no longer alive. It is the worst news that any parent can get, and Cheryl thought it was odd that Carol and her husband had never reached out to grieve with JB's family. They had never become close after both their daughters had died together, and I was thinking that maybe Carol held some resentment towards Cheryl because it was JB's birthday and Tracy was more of a follower than a leader. She was kind of going along with JB's plans that night in JB's car. Who knows? But the 2 families never connected with one another through their grief. Some people do want to be alone in these moments. Going back to the officers over in Ozark, when they were getting ready to transport the victims' bodies, they noticed a 9mm shell casing lying on the bend of one of Tracy's knees. As they carefully looked inside, they concluded that Tracy had been stuffed inside the trunk first. She had a single gunshot wound to her temple. They could see a cut on her arm, and under closer inspection, there were briar thorns stuck to her pant legs. She was still wearing a brand new pair of New Balance shoes, news that her parents said she just purchased the week before for about $95. But now they were covered in a thick layer of mud. It looked as though JB had a gunshot wound to her cheek. She also had mud on her shoes, and both girls' pants were wet from the knees down. Once the girls' bodies were removed from the trunk, the police carefully looked inside and concluded that the girls were killed after they were forced inside that trunk, but not at that location. They came to this conclusion based on a few reasons. There was some sort of indentation in the trunk where Tracy's head had been, and a 9mm shell casing was lying where JB's head was positioned. As for why they didn't think the car was in that location when the shots were fired, it It was because while looking over the car, the police kept hearing a dripping sound coming from below. When they checked underneath, they found blood that was dripping and blowback, and this signified that a bullet had gone through the trunk and the car had been moving when blood was dripping. There was also dried blood on the ground and somewhat of a trail, and then a large puddle, which signified to detectives that the car had been sitting there for a while. All this evidence led the police to believe the girls were attacked, then forced into the trunk and shot somewhere else, and then the car was moved to Herring Avenue hours earlier and abandoned. The police continued checking out the car, and inside they found more mud and sand, but they noticed it was only on the driver's side floor. This made them theorize the killer was the one that drove the car to Herring Avenue and left it there, taking JB's keys with them. The police also noticed that the rearview mirror was actually on the floor of the passenger side of the car. This meant that there was probably a struggle inside of that vehicle. It would take quite a lot of force to take a rearview mirror off like that. They checked for fingerprints, but the only ones they found were from the 2 officers that had searched the car before knowing that the girls were murdered. The Ozark police realized that they could not investigate these murders by themselves, so the Alabama Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies were brought in to assist them. Meanwhile, Dr. Gregory Wagner performed autopsies on the girls, and he concluded that JB was shot in the face close up and that she died immediately from a brainstem injury. There was gunpowder stippling on JB's hand, which indicated that the gun had been close to her when fired, but Dr. Wagner couldn't determine the exact distance. He noted that JB's shoes and the inside of her jeans were muddy, which suggested that her pants had been off at one point. That's how the dirt got inside. This was important because it could go towards a possible sexual motive if her clothes had been removed. Dr. Wagner concluded that Tracy died from a gunshot wound to the temple. He also found gunpowder stippling on the back of her right hand and determined the gun was about 2 feet away when fired. He could tell that Tracy's hand was close to her head. It wasn't outstretched when the gun went off. Her shoes and her jeans were muddy, and there was a bit of blood on her shoes. JB and Tracy didn't have drugs or alcohol in their systems, but they did have a lot of scratches and abrasions on their arms. There were no outward signs of forced sexual intercourse initially, and the reason being they usually look for tear marks or other signs of injuries to the genital region, and that was not observed. However, this was later questioned because they did vaginal swabs. JB had semen in her swabs, while Tracy did not. When they did further testing, swabbing the girls' bodies and testing their clothing, JB's bra, underwear, and sweater all had traces of semen on them, and her sweater had blood on it as well. A DNA profile was created with this evidence and sent to CODIS, and they were waiting to see if they could find a match. With the autopsies complete, the police focused on figuring out JB and Tracy's last moves. They knew the last time anyone heard from the girls was at 11:30 p.m. Bellevue, when they talked to Carol from the Big Little store in Ozark. The girls mentioned that 2 women had given them directions home. Police wanted to speak to these 2 women, and they soon learned they were Marilyn Merritt and her daughter, Marielle. They'd come forward after word got out about the murders. Marielle told police that around 11:30 p.m. on the 31st, she and her mom had gone to the Big Little store for a soda. When they pulled up, they saw one car in the parking lot, a black Mazda. Marielle walked up to the store but found the doors locked. The store had closed for the evening around 11 p.m. As she was turning to leave, JB approached her. Marielle said that her friend was using the payphone to the far right of the parking lot, and JB said they were lost. Marielle gave initial directions to US Highway 231, and then her mom, Marilyn, added a few landmarks that they should look out for. Marielle and Marilyn made sure the girls connected with someone on the phone before they left. When the police asked Marilyn and Marielle if the Mazda that the girls were driving was dirty, they said no. The car was spotless, and the girls were perfectly clean. Nothing seemed wrong except for them getting lost. Then, as the mother and daughter got back into their car and were heading out of the parking lot, they looked and saw the girls behind them getting into their vehicle. Then, They saw them pull to the end of the parking lot and make a right in the direction of the highway, just like they were told to do. Other information gathered from JB's family is that she had just filled up her gas tank on Saturday before the girls left for this trip, but it was found near empty when the car was located. After speaking to Marilyn and Marielle, detectives noted that Herring Avenue, where the Mazda was found, which was so close by, wasn't on the way back to Dothan, so how did the car end up there and on empty? It didn't make a lot of sense. Luckily, the Big Little store did have security cameras, so the police got surveillance video from inside the store and outside the store to verify the girls were there. Unfortunately, the surveillance system wasn't your typical system that records one area continuously. The system would record 12 seconds inside the store and then switch to 12 seconds in the parking lot, and then go back and forth for hours on end. The police sent the tape off to be sliced together so it would only include the area outside, and also so they could have it enhanced. When the police got the footage back, they saw something. It wasn't the best quality, even when enhanced. They saw that JB and Tracy were there at the time that Marielle and Marilyn recalled seeing them. But police noticed something else. A poor quality image of what appeared to be a white, foreign-made mid-size pickup truck that had arrived after Marielle and Marilyn had just pulled in, and Tracy and JB were on that payphone. The truck stayed at one of the gas pumps for about 3 minutes, and then left shortly before JB's car left. Since the store was closed, no one could have entered to pay with cash, and there was no record of a gas purchase at the pump during that period, with either a credit card or debit card. The video obtained from the surveillance camera did not capture any clear images of the driver leaving. The identity of the individual behind the wheel was unknown. Despite the efforts from police, they weren't able to gather any information regarding this white truck. They pleaded with the public to assist them in their investigation, but unfortunately, no one came forward with any information. I was looking at this picture that they released, and honestly to me it looks like a blob. I can't even tell what I'm looking at, so it's no wonder no one was able to identify anyone or anything in this picture. In addition to putting together a timeline for the girls, the police searched for the place where the girls had been shot. One spot they looked at was near Highway 123, just west of the Big Little store. Someone living in that area said that they heard gunshots around 2:15 in the morning, and they reported it to the police. When the investigators did go out there, they found shell casings on the road, but they eventually determined this was not the scene of the murder. This was because the shell casings were not a match. They kept searching diligently for weeks, trying to find out where JB and Tracy were killed, but they just could not determine the spot. By August 8th, a little after a week from when the bodies had been found, a hotline was set up to take in tips. There was a $25,000 reward offered. Flyers with pictures of Tracy and JB in the Mazda were plastered everywhere. The police had talked to over 150 people and followed many leads, but the progress was slow. The police worked non-stop to solve this case, and by August 18th, the reward was over $35,000, and 3 FBI profilers had actually joined the investigation. They hoped that this would help them find a suspect, but it didn't. It was on September 1st that the police released that surveillance footage I was telling you about of the truck that I couldn't even make out. No one ever came forward with any tips. But there was about to be a big break in this case. A tip came in from a man named John William Barentine. At 11:30 p.m. the night of July 31st, 1999, the same night that JB and Tracy got lost in Ozark and were at the Big Little store on the phone with Tracy's mom, John, a 28-year-old part-time mechanic, told his wife he was going to go to the store to get some milk for their 2-year-old son. The thing is, according to his wife, he didn't come home until close to 1 o'clock in the morning. When he came through the door, he appeared to be very upset. She asked him what happened, and he said, quote, "I was hit by a black truck with a Dothan tag near Herring Avenue," end quote. Well, we know that JB was from Dothan, and her vehicle was found on Herring Avenue. It was black, but it wasn't a truck, and there was no damage that would have connected it to any kind of accident. In the next few days, John began talking to his friends and family members, saying that he thought he might know something about the two dead girls. That was how he referred to them. John told one of his friends, Leon Jordan, that he thought he might know who did it, and Leon told him, if you know something, you should report it, especially because there's a reward for any information leading to an arrest. So on September 1st, Leon was aware that John was at the police station being questioned. Well, the next day, on September 2nd, the Ozark police shared some big news that everyone had been waiting for. They had made an arrest. It may come as a surprise, but it was none other than the man they questioned the day before, John Barentine. At first, the police didn't tell the public how he was connected. During a press conference about the arrest, the Ozark Police Chief, Tony Spivey, said he couldn't give out much information. However, he was confident that they had the right person. He explained that the investigation wasn't over and they were still trying to figure out a motive. The only detail that Chief Spivey could share was that John didn't know the girls and that the murder seemed to be a crime of opportunity. While John's mother and his 3 sisters were visibly upset at this press conference, afterward, they criticized the police for not sharing the evidence that allegedly linked him to the murders. They claimed he wasn't involved. They described John as a little bit strange, a bit of a loner, but they insisted he was not a killer. Jennifer, one of John's sisters, said the police were setting him up for someone else's crime. Angela, another sister of John's, mentioned that on the night of the murders, John did leave home, but not for hours like his wife said. It was only for 15 minutes to buy milk at the convenience store off of US Highway 231. Angela questioned, "How could my brother commit a double murder in such a short amount of time?" She emphasized that John was soft-hearted. He was a man that couldn't even bear to see a woman cry. Plus, he did not own a gun. Following the news of John's arrest, the media interviewed people that knew him, and almost every single one said they were surprised to hear that he was being blamed for the murders of JB and Tracy. One neighbor said that John acted a little strange, but she never saw a violent side of him. He was always really friendly to her. She never would have thought he'd be capable of murder. Many people have been fooled before, so I'm never sure about that. A regular customer at the service station where John worked said that he was always really sweet to her. She'd never even seen him upset, and she was never scared of him. She didn't think he had it in his nature to kill. Even John's boss said he didn't think he was responsible, and everyone in town was saying the same thing. He added that he wanted to know what police had against John and why they weren't talking about it. Days later, on September 9th, there was still no news about John's alleged connection to the murders. Chief Spivey said he understood the people had questions, but it wasn't the right time to give more details since, as they always say, this was an ongoing investigation. That's reasonable, but he assured everyone that he was confident the police had arrested the right guy. On September 20th, there was a preliminary hearing to figure out if the state had enough evidence to move forward with the charges against John Barentine. This was the first time anyone outside the police department had heard the evidence against him. During that hearing, the police finally shared that a few days after JB and Tracy were killed, they got a tip that actually led them to John. This tip came from a clerk working at a video store who told police that he recorded a talk he had with a man named John. John wanted to check his surveillance tapes. That's right, from the Big Little store. John claimed that a fight had broken out on July 31st, and he needed the tape to figure out the exact time because John was inquiring about a video, the exact night and place where the girls were last seen, where a murder took place nearby. It was really odd to the clerk, and that's why he recorded this conversation. The clerk told the police he did not know John's last name, but he knew he had an account under Mary or Barry Barentine, and the address was 109 Young Avenue in Ozark. When police went to that location, it didn't exist. However, they were able to locate a Mary Barentine at 110 Young Avenue, and she was married to a man named John. So they spoke to her. When they asked Mary where her husband was on July 31st, that is when she told them he left around 11 p.m. to buy some milk for their son. At first, Mary did say he was only gone for 15 minutes, but then she changed her story saying it could have been longer. She wasn't positive because he had taken her watch with him, and I was in there thinking she didn't have a clock inside her whole home. Fair enough, I guess. But then Mary said when John got back, she thought it had been at least an hour, maybe even 2, and she asked him why it took so long. That's when he told her that a black truck forced him off the road off of James and Herring Avenue, which is actually right where JB's Mazda was found. Not just on the street, but almost the exact location. The police then talked to John at his workplace about this black truck, and John said that when he went out to get the milk, he took the long way to Grocery Outlet, going down James Street. He claimed that the black truck with tinted windows and a 38 car tag came off of Herring and hit his car, then drove onto Matthew Street. John told the police that he arrived at the Grocery Outlet to buy milk at 11:35 p.m., and on his way home, he kept checking to see if the black truck was following him. Once John was back home, he just couldn't sleep, so he took a shower and then watched Rocky Thuri until 3 a.m. The next day, he told police he used a rag to buff out the damage that the black truck had done to his car. Then he told his friends and family members that he thought there might be a connection between the black truck that hit him and the murders because of the close proximity. Before he could come forward with any information, the police had already tracked the man down. They wanted to see that rag that he used to buff off his car. They were hoping that it had traces of black paint on it, so they asked him to bring it down to the station with him. When John showed up, as requested, you think he brought the rag? He didn't, but he did show the police where he said he got hit. One officer, an experienced accident investigator, believed there was no damage to John's car and that it had never been hit by a black truck or any vehicle. The police then confronted John and said the Grocery Outlet closed at 9 p.m., so what's your story? That meant John couldn't have been there to purchase milk that night. They caught him in a lie, and that's when John admitted, "You're right, I lied, I just wanted to collect the reward money." The police asked John to tell them what really happened on the night of July 31st, and that is when this story goes off the rails. This man was questioned for 4 hours in a videotaped interview, and his story changed, I think, at least 6 times. First, he told them he was home all night, but Mary, who was in the police station as well being questioned, contradicted that. She insisted, no, he definitely left for milk. John then changed his story again, saying he actually went to the BP gas station on US 231 to buy milk, and he was there for 20 minutes, and then he drove home. He claimed that on his way home he passed the Big Little store, where he saw JB and Tracy on the payphone outside. But then, John told the police another story. In this version, he claimed a man with tattoos, who worked for his uncle and lived in a white house nearby, was the one that killed Tracy and JB. According to John, when he left for the store, he picked this man up at a 4-way stop sign. As they passed the Big Little, the man saw JB and Tracy, and he suggested to John that they get some. I think you know what he'd be referring to. Well, of course, this piqued the detectives' interest since they were already aware there may be a sexual motive. John said he pulled into the parking lot, and the tattooed man went up to talk to the girls. Then he climbed into the back seat of the Mazda on the driver's side while one of the girls was still on the phone. Eventually, the girls drove off with that man in their car, and John followed them, thinking that maybe the man was going to need a ride. The Mazda stopped on Herring Avenue, so John parked on James Street, turned his lights off and his engine. Somehow he could hear the conversation that the man was having with the girls. According to John, this tattooed man and the girl who drove the Mazda got out of the car, and that's when he said the girl asked, "I thought you were going to give us directions. What are we doing in the woods?" The tattooed man replied, I will, but first you've got to give me some." John said he saw the girl who had been sitting in the passenger side get out and start to run, but the tattooed man grabbed her and dragged her back to the car. John told the police the smart one jumped on his back while he was dragging the other girl. Then, John said he watched the man put both of the girls into the trunk, and he heard 2 gunshots. Then, the tattooed man frantically ran to John's car and told him to let him get inside. He jumped in with the Mazda's keys in one hand and a gun in the other. John said they drove around for a while until he let the man out somewhere in Ozark. That is quite a story, and a lot of the things he said actually added up. How did he know all that? Well, the newspapers were talking about a lot of the facts. John was arrested after telling all of these different stories to the police. Even though he said there was another guy there, John put himself at the location where the girls were last seen, and he seemed to know way too much information not to be involved. So, they arrested him and charged him with 2 counts of capital murder. At John's preliminary hearing, the police testified that they investigated John's claims about this tattooed man killing JB and Tracy, but they eventually ruled him out as a suspect when 3 people confirmed that the man was with them on the night of the murders. At that point, the police were convinced that John and a second unknown suspect were actually the ones involved in the murders. So the investigation continued. After this, there was also evidence that after John was arrested, his cellmate came forward. There's nothing like a jailhouse snitch, and he claimed that John confessed to the murders. This only helped solidify their case against John. At the preliminary hearing, John's defense said there were way too many unanswered questions to take these charges any further. There was no motive, evidence. John didn't own a gun, he never found the gun, and there was no physical evidence tying John to the murders. Because at this point, the DNA had been analyzed, and when it was put into CODIS, there was no match. But they had yet to test it against John's DNA. Remember, the detectives believed that John and what they called another unknown suspect were involved in the murders. Well, perhaps John wasn't the one who engaged in sexual relations. The defense mentioned that John had since recanted all of his stories. He said he went to the police for the money, that's it. But the prosecution, of course, countered this statement, claiming that John didn't go to the police for the reward money. The police approached him after hearing from that video store clerk. At the end of the hearing, Judge Buddy Matthews found that there was enough evidence to at least keep John behind bars until the case could be referred to the grand jury in January of 2000. By the middle of October, John had a court hearing to decide if he was going to stay in jail without bail, and during this hearing, his defense attorney did something unusual. They had John get on the stand so that he could tell the judge that he had nothing to do with JB and Tracy's murders. John said he lied about everything. He lied about seeing the girls get killed, he lied about all those stories, and he just wanted money to pay off his bills. He claimed that he was tired and confused during that long interview with police, and he just said what they wanted to hear so he could go home. At the end of the hearing, the judge decided that John should stay in jail without bail. He ordered John to provide a DNA sample for testing against the semen found on JB. John's friends and family stood by him. His mother, Faith, said he didn't do it. He's not capable of doing it. He has a 2-year-old son, and he's not capable of doing anything to hurt a child. In early November, John's attorney announced the DNA did not match, but the police said this didn't change their investigation. They still firmly believed that John and another person were involved. But after this news came out, Judge McLinn lowered John's bail to $200,000, and in mid-December, he somehow posted that bail. On January 10, 2000, the grand jury decided not to charge John with murder. At first, the police made it seem like they were going to continue this investigation into John, but soon they said that he was no longer considered a suspect, and they were back at the beginning. The big question was, what were they going to do next? It seemed like they wasted a lot of time going after a man who really didn't seem connected. A few days later, they increased the reward to $45,000, and then a new team of investigators joined the Ozark Police Department to help. They kept working hard on this case, but the leads were slowing down. Months had passed, and things got even slower after the tragic murder of JB and Tracy. A memorial fund was established in JB's honor at the Compass Bank in Dothan. This fund's objective was to sponsor a free performing arts camp for underprivileged children, and they would fund a piece of choreography to be set annually in honor of JB. Parents and students at the dance school that JB performed at were responsible for this fund, and it was their desire to honor her memory by positively impacting the lives of the children and their community. The community came together in other ways that I thought were amazing. Central Phoenix High School was the rival to Northview High, where JB and Tracy went. However, after their murder at the very first pep rally, Central Phoenix High School decided to show their support and send a gift to Northview. The gift was a banner that displayed a heartfelt message. The banner read, "Rivals, yes, but friends nonetheless." It was really nice to see everyone come together. It's just sad that it had to be under these circumstances. Then, just a few months into the new year, in February of 2000, two teenage girls in Mississippi were found dead, shot in the back of the head, and left on the side of the road. Police began investigating a possible connection between these two cases. The victims in this new case were Amanda Welburn and Kelsey Bullock. However, after conducting a thorough investigation, it was determined that there was no connection between the two cases. Two men were eventually arrested for the murder of Amanda and Kelsey. Their names were Paul Evans Jr. and Nathan Townsend. Both of the men were convicted and sentenced. There were other leads, other suspects, so to speak. One was from Battle Creek, Michigan. Police did not disclose the person's name, but they noted that he was at a party the night of the murders, right near where JB's car was found, and then he left town within days of the murder. To further investigate the possible connection, they interviewed the suspect and traveled all the way to Michigan on several occasions. This man was unable to account for 3 or 4 hours on the night of the murders, and he made statements that were suspicious to police. However, his DNA failed to match the DNA discovered at the crime scene. Eventually, the police had to move on and focus their attention elsewhere. At the 1-year mark, the case was going cold. Cheryl wanted to keep the girls in the news and in the public eye. She had an idea of placing the girls' photos on utility bills, as well as having their pictures on the envelopes until the murder investigation was solved. Cheryl also wanted the girls' pictures to be displayed in public places like sports complexes. Cheryl asked the city to please donate the Civic Center to host a charity ball in honor of the girls, with the proceeds going toward funding things like billboards. Meanwhile, Tracy's parents, Mike and Carol Roberts, made a memorial in the spot where JB and Tracy's bodies were found, 2 white crosses. They put them there at the anniversary of their murders, and by August of 2000, Mike had to put the crosses up for a 3rd time. The first 2 times, they were stolen. Who would even do that? However, the 3rd time, Mike installed the crosses using quick-dry cement, which made it harder for the thieves to steal. Mike Roberts told the media that he vowed to get justice for his stepdaughter Tracy, even if he had to take his last breath on Earth doing it. I saw a bumper sticker on the back of his truck that read, "Someone I loved was murdered." That same month, August 2000, America's Most Wanted filmed a special on this case. The host, John Walsh, traveled all the way to Dothan, Alabama to film a reenactment of the murders of JB and Tracy. The purpose of this episode was to generate new and relevant information about the case, and it focused heavily on that white pickup truck seen in the Big Little parking lot at the same time the girls were making that phone call. However, at the time, Cheryl was not aware that they were going to depict a reenactment of her daughter's murder. Cheryl told the media that watching that episode was going to be really scary for her. Police ended up with many tips after the segment aired, but nothing was relevant. In December of 2000, a tip was received at Crime Stoppers. It was said that a weapon used in the murder of JB and Tracy could be located in a creek in northern Dale County. The tip stated that the gun was submerged 6 to 8 feet underwater, so they sent divers down there to search by hand. They devoted several days to scouring this creek, but unfortunately, no weapons were found. I feel like there were so many potential leads that led them literally nowhere. So JB's mother, Cheryl, was invited to do a segment on the Maury Povich show. I don't know if you remember this, it was actually called I Need to Solve My Child's Murder. The episode aired in January of 2001. Cheryl sat with 4 other parents of murdered children, and they shared their stories and their hope of seeking justice for their loved ones. The decision to appear on this show was not easy for Cheryl. She had to fly to New York to film this episode, and she knew that it would require immense emotional strength and courage. However, she felt that it was one of her last opportunities to do something significant and find answers about who murdered her daughter. She knew that they had to keep attention on this case. There were other suspects that were in question, but each one of them was thoroughly investigated, and after years went by, the murders still remained unsolved. Tracy and JB's friends and family were still holding on to hope that they would get justice. Every year on the anniversary of their tragic deaths, their loved ones would gather at the site where the car was discovered, and they would honor them. Years later, 16 years later in 2015, the Thursday Review published 2 write-ups about JB and Tracy's case. They interviewed JB's sisters, Jo Beth, Jackie, and her mom Cheryl, and her cousin Lindsay. That is where I got a lot of the information about who JB was and how everything unfolded on that fateful day. The family was notified back in 1999. It had been 16 long years with no answers. The article included a picture of 20-year-old Jillian, 23-year-old Jo Beth, 26-year-old Jackie, and 27-year-old Jamie, posing with a portrait of their late sister, JB Beasley, who would have been 33 years old that year. They said they would never give up hope that her killer would be found. Jackie said that she thought of JB every time the clock hit 11:11 because JB used to stop and say, "Make a wish." When asked if Jackie thought JB knew her killer, she said that she thought it could be someone they knew or possibly an authority figure. She didn't think her sister would have pulled over for anyone else, especially at that time of night. When asked what they did to keep this case alive, Jackie said they created a Facebook group for JB and Tracy, and they had almost 4,000 members. They said they were selling vinyl stickers that said "Justice for JB and Tracy" on them, and they were using that money to help raise awareness for the case. They also planned things like a car wash and a 5K to raise money. They said they would never stop searching for answers. When Cheryl was interviewed, she told the reporter that after 16 years, she still lived in the same area. In 2006, she actually graduated from Troy University with a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice, and that the murder of JB had left her relationship with her other daughters very strained. She loved them so much, but it was really hard for her to remain close, especially since one of them looks strikingly similar to JB, and that was really tough for her. That is actually very sad that this murder has so many ripple effects. Well, I want to fast forward to the 20-year anniversary of JB and Tracy's unsolved murders. The Ozark Police Department was desperate to solve this case and willing to try anything, and that's when they decided to bring in a laboratory. Not just any laboratory, Parabon Nano Labs. They wanted to use genetic genealogy to solve this case. Remember, they still had that DNA. This lab uses advanced genetic sequencing techniques, and their expertise in this field has been instrumental in solving cold cases. They do this by identifying potential suspects through DNA databases and matching them to family trees. It lets the police identify a potential suspect by looking at DNA from family members who are willing to share that DNA in a genealogy database. This helps investigators create a bigger family tree than before. So, this lab narrowed down the results to only 5 people, and when Ozark Chief Mosley Walker saw the list, one name stood out: Coley Lewis McCraney. He and the chief had actually gone to high school together in Dothan. He looked back through the files and found out that Coley, who had only been 23 at the time of the murders, was never questioned and never considered a suspect. He didn't have a criminal record, so his DNA wouldn't have been in CODIS, so they wouldn't have gotten a match anyway. But police checked into Coley's background and learned he was born in 1974 in Quincy, Florida, and then his family moved to Ozark, Alabama, when he was 3 or 4 years old. Coley grew up with his 3 older sisters. His dad was a carpenter and his mother worked at a nursing home. While he was a junior at Carroll High School, Coley started dating a woman named Zaffer. They had a child before Coley graduated in 1992. He and Zaffer remarried, and in that same year, they welcomed another child. Coley then joined the Air Force and supported his family while he was stationed out in Mississippi. Interestingly, Police noted that Koci had registered a high-caliber 9mm pistol that he had received during his military service, and that was the same type of gun that was used to kill JB and Tracy. In 1994, Koci and Zafre divorced, and Koci no longer wanted to be in the military, so he left, receiving a general discharge. He stayed in the Ocean Springs area and worked at a casino and then a fire department. It wasn't long before he started dating a woman named Cindy. They also welcomed a child together, and then he moved all the way to New York, but that relationship didn't last. So, Koci returned to Ozark and moved in with his mom. He worked odd jobs before going into the semi-truck industry. He went to school in 1997 and started dating a woman named Diana, with whom he had another child a year later. Koci finished school and became a long-haul trucker. He worked for 3 or 4 weeks and then came home for a few days. He moved into a home on Linby Drive in none other than the town of Ozark, and this home was about a half a mile away from both the Big Little Store and Herring Avenue, where JB's car was found. This meant that Koci lived within a short walk of where JB and Tracy were last seen and where their bodies were found. There were a lot of connections here, with the most important being his DNA, which was a match to the DNA found inside JB's body. About a year before the murders, in March of 1998, Koci began dating a woman named Jeanette, and she moved into Koci's house just a few months later. In June, Koci and Jeanette then bought some land next to Koci's mom's house, but before they could move into a trailer on that land, Koci had to clean it all out. He did this when he wasn't driving his semi-truck. Well, Koci wasn't faithful to Jeanette, and in September of 1998, a woman claimed that he was the father of her child. A judge ordered a DNA test on July 30th, 1999, just one day before the murders of JB and Tracy. But despite being ordered to take this test, Koci never showed up. Instead, he just decided to pay the child support without providing his DNA. I wonder why. Over the next few years, there were many petitions for child support accusing him of not even paying. In mid-August of 1999, Koci and Jeanette moved on to that land they had bought, and on June 25, 2001, they got married, they welcomed 2 children, and Koci kept working as a trucker. But I want you to fast forward to late 2018. Koci and Jeanette are married. They're now living in Dothan. Their daughter is a high school senior, their son is in college, and he's still a trucker. But now he also runs a religious nonprofit called Spirit and Truth Lifeline Ministries. He's a bishop and a preacher at a local church. He seems like he's on the straight and narrow. So could he have been involved with the murders? In order to find out, Chief Walker got in touch with 45-year-old Koci in January of 2019, and he asked him if he would help him out by giving him his DNA to build out a family tree for a case he was working on. Koci asked his wife what he should do, and she said, "You have nothing to hide." So, he decided to give a sample of his DNA. When his DNA was compared to the scene evidence from JB's body and clothing in late February, that match was made. The odds of the DNA coming from anyone else was extremely rare. I'm talking 1 in 122 million. That's 122 followed by 30 zeros. Yeah, this proved that Koci had sexual relations with JB, but it didn't prove that he murdered anyone. But when police looked for any connection between Koci, JB, and Tracy, there was none. There would be no reason for his DNA to be on JB's clothes or body. They weren't dating, and they didn't have any friends in common, so something wasn't adding up. Koci was under police watch until they could make an arrest, and on March 15th, Koci was finally arrested and taken to the station for questioning. The detective's first question was if he knew about JB and Tracy's murder. He acknowledged that he heard about it through town, but claimed he didn't know them. He had never met them before. That's when the detectives told him his DNA matched the DNA found in the murder. Koci took a deep breath, turned his face away from the detectives, and muttered, "This can't be happening." The detective suggested going back to the beginning and discussing his background, so that's what he did. When walking through what he had done throughout his life, detectives again said they had DNA and they knew he killed the girls. That's when Koci asked for an attorney. Detective Michael Bryan responded by saying, "Let me explain something to you. There's no lawyer that can change any facts of this case. Koci kept asking where his lawyer was, and Brian kept saying they hadn't called a lawyer. Koci asked if he could call one himself, and the detective replied, "Koci, all I want from you is just to listen to me. Just listen to me for a second. Listen to me. What I want from you is the complete truth. You know what? Look." And that's when he grabbed a folder. He shuffled through printed photos and he said, "Let me show you again." Koci asked if he could get a lawyer, and Brian said, "Absolutely." But he didn't end the interview. Instead, he put a photo of Koli's family on the table in front of him, and then he added a second photo of JB, and then of Tracy during their autopsies. Koci asked him, "So, we're not going to do the lawyer?" And Brian responded, "We can do the lawyer if you want a lawyer. Absolutely, absolutely. I never denied that you could have a lawyer, so I don't want that to get misconstrued. All I want you to be aware of are the facts of this case. And the facts are that Koci Lewis McCraney's DNA matches the DNA found on the murdered body of J.B. Beasley." Ryan told Koci that he was going to tell the district attorney's office that Koci was a savage individual who kidnapped the girls, viciously attacked them, and forced one of them to have sex with him, and then intentionally executed both of them. Brian removed the photos from the table, and Koci asked, "Are you putting that on me?" Brian said, "Koci, you're the only one that can give the truth." Koci continued asking for an attorney, and in response, Brian put more photos on the table in front of him. Koci said he didn't have to do that, and then the detectives left him alone for 10 minutes. Then the detectives told Koci that they weren't going to ask any more questions, but they wanted to inform him that he was going to be charged with 5 counts of capital murder and a sex crime in the first degree. Koci just replied, "Come on, man." But Brian continued trying to get him to talk. At one point, Koci started to cry, and he said he never heard anyone ever. The interview finally ended, and Koci stayed in police custody. Koli's wife, Jeanette, was also questioned, and she was asked what she knew about the murders of JB and Tracy. She said that she'd heard about them, but she didn't have any knowledge of what happened. Detectives then told Jeanette that Koli's DNA was a match for the semen found on JB. Jeanette said all that proved was that Koci had sexual relations with JB. It didn't mean he was a murderer. Jeanette didn't think Koci was guilty, and she remained faithfully by his side. Surprisingly, many people who knew Koci thought he was innocent. Jeanette defended him during the news conferences. She said that she wanted to let people know that he didn't force himself on anyone, and he didn't murder anybody. She described Koci as a family man who pushed his children to succeed academically and even quizzed her on Bible history. Chief Walker himself, who knew Koci, said he was very surprised when Koli's name was a match for the DNA. Remember, they went to high school together. He said, "Every person I talked to said the same thing, but DNA doesn't lie." Of course, there were many people who were thankful that Koci had been arrested and that the case had seemingly been solved. Tracy's mom and stepfather, Carol and Mike, spoke to the media. Mike said, "We've been through pure hell for the last 20 years. I know we're going to have to go through a lot more because we're going to have to relive it again, and I'm ready to relive it. I'm going to put somebody behind bars, get him prosecuted, and get this over with. Maybe we can sleep at night." Then he added, "I'd like to see Koci get the death penalty." Carol said, "I sat down and read Exodus, where it says that if you take a person's life, you should have to give up your life. That's the law, and I honestly believe that should be what happens." They were both all for the death penalty because Koci had lived for 20 years in freedom, and he shouldn't live a day more on this earth. They thought that it needed to be done quickly. Now, JB's mom didn't speak to the media following the news of Koli's arrest, but I think it's safe to assume that she was also grateful that the case had been solved and an arrest had been made. But on the other hand, JB's biological father, Hilton, was skeptical. He didn't know if the police actually had the right guy. He told reporters that his legal advisor told him it would have been difficult for just one person to have committed such a heinous double murder. Hilton said, "This is not the work of a single person. We may be wrong, but my attitude is, I just have to wait and evaluate." After Koci was charged, the defense geared up for trial, and they considered two possible other suspects to present to the jury. Remember good old John Barentine? That's one. Also, a former Ozark police officer was a suspect. The defense wanted to suggest that John Barentine, who had passed away, might have been the killer, but the prosecution argued there was no evidence to support that claim. The judge sided with the prosecution and barred the defense from bringing up John. But like I said, they also explored the idea that a former police officer might be responsible. This officer came to the defense's attention through a blog post in 2015. It alleged that a woman named Marina Crum knew what happened to JB and Tracy. She claimed a former officer, in a drunken state, confessed he was involved in the murders. She said it was to conceal cassette tapes revealing local cops' involvement in the drug trade. There are so many weird twists in this case, but after the blog was published, this former police officer filed a defamation lawsuit. Marina's allegations gained a lot of public attention. I mean, of course, a police officer involved in the murder of two teenagers. Many people believed she was going to be a crucial witness for the defense, but during the evidentiary hearings, she admitted it was all a lie. So the defense would no longer be able to use her as a witness, and they lost all their alternative suspects. Now they had to come up with a totally different tactic, and I have to say what they came up with was pretty wild. Finally, just this year, on April 19th, 2023, the trial for 49-year-old Koci McCraney began. It was led by Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. The prosecution told the jury all about JB and Tracy, how they were both extremely friendly, how they had their whole lives ahead of them, and so much more. The prosecution explained that on July 31, 1999, JB and Tracy got lost on their way to a party. They asked for directions at the Big Little store in Ozark, then used a payphone to call Tracy's mom. The prosecution theorized that after the call, Koci confronted the girls at gunpoint, ordered them into JB's car, and made her drive to a marshy area. There he commanded JB to undress and made her have sex with him. Then, when he was finished, he forced both girls into the trunk. Koci shot JB and Tracy at close range. He later drove the car to Herring Avenue and walked home to his house that was close by. The prosecution argued that even though neither one of the girls' autopsies revealed signs of vaginal injuries, that wasn't necessary to classify this as forced. Injuries weren't always present, and the forensic pathologists who conducted the autopsies said you could have consensual or non-consensual intercourse, and both can or cannot produce injuries. The Attorney General ordered Jeanette to testify at a trial. Now, she hadn't been married to Koci at the time of the murders, so she did not have any marital privileges. Jeanette talked about what happened on July 30th, 31st, and August 1st. She said Koci returned from a long-haul trucking job on the 30th. The next day, Jeanette went to work while Koci went to their land to clear it out. According to Jeanette, she arrived home from work around 8 p.m. and Koci came home shortly afterward at 8:20. He was sweaty from working outside, so he took a shower. 2 hours later, close to 10:30 p.m., she said Koci left to visit his mom's house. He hadn't seen his family in weeks, so he decided to pay them a visit. Jeanette said she remembered that Koci returned home right before 1 a.m. She knew this because they had a rule that after 11:30 p.m., the chain had to go on the door. So she locked the chain lock on the door at that point and went to the couch to watch TV. When Koci came home, Jeanette was still awake, and the chain was on the door, so she had to get up and open the door for Koci. She recalls the time. She said Koci's clothes were completely clean. There were no signs of blood or mud, and he told Jeanette that his car had been broken down at the Big Little store, forcing him to walk back home. He asked her to come with him and jump his car. So Jeanette actually left the house, drove with Koci to the store, and they were able to jump his car before returning home. They got back at 1:20 a.m. They slept for a few hours, and then later that morning, they got up and went to Walmart. They bought some supplies for his car and for the road because Koci had to leave that very next evening. They didn't talk for the next 3 or 4 days, which was typical because Koci didn't have a cell phone, just a pager. Jeanette testified that a few days after the murders occurred, her mom told her what happened. Jeanette thought about reaching out to the police since she and Koci had been to that same Big Little store on the same night. But, in the end, she didn't contact them because she'd only seen Koci's broken-down car at the store. No one else and no other vehicle were there. There was nothing suspicious in her mind. Jeanette said she never heard anything that would indicate that Koci met, had sex with, or killed JB and Tracy. But let's face it, Jeanette puts Koci's car in the exact same parking lot where the girls were on the same night, and his DNA was found on JB. Still, the defense argued the wrong person was arrested. They claimed that JB had consensual sex with Koci on the night she was killed. According to the defense, on July 31st, Koci, then a 23-year-old player, that's what they called him, encountered JB and Tracy at the Big Little store. He gave them directions, and then he hopped in JB's car and continued talking. Eventually, they decided to have consensual sex. When they were done, the girls dropped Koci off at his house. The defense said someone else then killed JB and Tracy. First of all, Tracy already got directions for Marilyn and Marielle. They were on a mission to get back to Tracy's, but even had plans to stop and meet Tracy's boyfriend, Wade. They even called him and said they were on their way. So why would they entertain this random guy? And Tracy just stands by while her friend has sex with him. Real fast then, coincidentally, they get killed by someone else? It just seems way too far-fetched. But the defense emphasized there was no evidence proving Koci was the killer. The only evidence tying Koci to the girls was seen, and that came from consensual sex, not force. The defense also told the jury that in 2019, during Koci's arrest, the police treated him horribly. They used tactics that he compared to Nazi Germany, and like I told you, it is true. The defense pointed out that Koci requested a lawyer 8 times, but wasn't provided one. He then spent 25 hours in that interrogation room sleeping on a mat on the ground. But that doesn't change his DNA being present. Chief Walker was called to testify, and he said they delayed booking Koci into jail to wait for a search warrant and to tie up loose ends. The chief argued that Koci was fine. He was moved into a conference room. He was given meals, and they talked about other things besides the murder, like high school basketball and football. During the trial, the defense only called a few witnesses, including a newspaper delivery person, a man who lived on Broad Street, the same street as the Big Little store, and Koci McCraney himself. The newspaper delivery person, his name is Dan, said that he was delivering newspapers in Ozark around 2:15 in the morning on August 1st, and he noticed a Mazda with emergency lights on at James Street and Herring Avenue. Dan said he saw the car several times during his deliveries that morning. On a second sighting, a Mercury Grand Marquis was parked behind the Mazda, with 2 people and a juvenile inside. He said he thought it was an undercover police car due to the strobe lights. Dan mentioned seeing the Mazda again around 2:45, this time with an Ozark Police Department car nearby. Later, around 7 a.m., the Mazda had been moved to Herring Avenue. It wasn't until Dan saw the news article about JB and Tracy's murders that had a picture of the car that he realized the significance. He contacted the police and shared what he had seen. The defense also called a man named Jimmy, who lived on Broad Street in 1999, to testify. He said that around 11:20 p.m. on July 31st, he was cleaning his balcony when he noticed a white truck and a Mazda driving down the road, intersecting with Broad Street. The cars were moving at a moderate speed without being aggressive, and they entered the parking lot and turned off their lights. Jimmy then heard a noise, and after 15 minutes, both cars drove towards the Big Little store. Jimmy could see the silhouette of a man in the truck, but couldn't identify anyone that was in the Mazda. Initially, he didn't think much of it until he saw the picture of the Mazda in the newspaper. Finally, Koci McCraney himself took the stand in his defense. It was obvious the man was nervous, and his testimony was shaky. He claimed he already knew JB. That's right, the 2 of them met in June of 1999 in the mall in Dothan, where he dropped off his girlfriend Jeanette at work. He said he stopped at Radio Shack, and JB happened to be nearby, so they talked, and JB introduced herself as Jennifer. Koci said that's how he knew her. He never knew her name was JB. That's a nice try, but everyone who truly knew JB strongly disagreed with the statement. Throughout her entire life, she made sure people knew that her name was JB. It didn't stand for Jennifer. We know it actually stands for James, which Koci would have never guessed. But Koci went on to tell the jury he gave this girl, Jennifer, as he's calling her, his mom's home phone number instead of his own. He didn't have a cell phone, and he didn't want JB to call his house while his girlfriend was around. Koci said JB called him at his mom's house on the same day they met, and then again in July. They had plans to meet up whenever they could. However, they didn't actually get to see each other until July 31st, the night she was murdered. It's so interesting that she happened to get lost right near his house that she'd never been to. But anyway, Koci said he returned home from the long-haul trucking job on July 30th and parked his truck at the truck stop on County Road 18. He explained that his semi was too big to park at home, so he had to park it at the truck stop. Then, he said on July 31st, he worked on the land that he and Jeanette owned next to his mom's place. Around 3 p.m., that's when JB happened to call him at his mom's, and they planned to meet at his old high school in Ozark at 10 p.m. Now remember, the girls were lost in Ozark. They had no idea where they were, and they were headed to a party in a totally different direction. So this made no sense, but Koci still tried to make it make sense. He said later that night he drove to the Big Little store, waiting for JB until 10 p.m. It was never explained why he claimed to have waited at the store instead of the high school. This man had his story all over the place, but again we know the girls pulled into the first place they saw that was open or they thought was open. But Koci said when JB didn't show up around 10 or 10:30, he returned to his mom's house since that was the only way that JB was going to be able to contact him. But she never called, so he just spent time with his family before leaving around 11:45 p.m. On the way home, his car started to act up and then it broke down, but somehow he coasted right into the Big Little parking lot. He expects us to believe that at the same time that the girls happened to get lost, he went to the same spot and broke down. Good thing his car made it. He said after breaking down, he looked over and noticed, "Oh my gosh, Jennifer, she's at the payphone." Koci then said he went up and talked to the girls, and JB mentioned she was running a little late to get home. Koci told her he knew a shortcut back to Dothan, and he asked if they could drop him off on their way since his car was clearly out of commission. The girls agreed, and he sat in the back passenger seat of the Mazda. Now this is the part one think has some truth to it. He said at 11:45 p.m. and they left the Big Little, and during that drive, Koci chatted with JB while Tracy seemed lost in her own thoughts. About 8 minutes later, they were near the truck stop where Koci parked, so he suggested they stop and take a look at his truck. They pulled over, JB and Koci got out, and they got in the front seat of his semi-TR, while Tracy stayed in the Mazda. Koci said one thing led to another, and they ended up having sex in a bed that he had in the back of his semi. The defense asked if he had forced JB into the truck, and he said, absolutely not. After they had sex, they talked, and then JB mentioned she was in a hurry to meet someone. They got out of the truck and back into the Mazda, and then Koci asked to be dropped off on Broad Street to avoid being seen by Jeanette. He said the girls dropped him off about 12:30 in the morning, and he walked home. I'm not buying his version of events at all. Let me know what you think happened, but there's more. Before we finish, Koci explained that's when he asked Jeanette to help him jump his car at the Big Little store. They jumped the car, and they were back home at around 1 a.m. Koci said he stayed home for the rest of the night, and the next day they went to Walmart before he left for his long-haul truck trip. Koci testified he only learned about the murders weeks later when Jeanette told him. He expects us to believe he never tried to reach out to these girls again. He never called Jennifer, never saw her again, and never tried to reach out again. It was just this random one-night stand. 'Cause wouldn't you have heard she was murdered if you tried to get in touch with her after the fact? Koci said he gave his DNA because he had nothing to do with the murders, and he was shocked when he was arrested because he had no idea what it could be about. He never told the detectives that he knew the girls when they asked him because he was scared. Once they put him in handcuffs, he figured they already made up their minds. He wants us to believe he never saw pictures of these girls in all the newspapers in the small town. This was a big story that was featured on TV shows. He couldn't have at least recognized the woman, even if he didn't know her name. He wouldn't have just come forward and said, "Oh my goodness, I was with her that night. I can't believe she was murdered." Well, during the cross-examination by the prosecution, they poked holes in his story one after the other. One of the first things they wanted to know was how JB knew to call Koci's mom's house that night on the 31st. He explained, "Oh well, I told her I was only there on the weekends, so that's when she would call." Well, the prosecution brought out a notepad, and they had been jotting things down that he said happened on July 31st, and this is where they put all the inconsistencies on display for the jury. According to Koci, he had plans to meet with JB at 1 p.m. He described this as a date. They told him it was a remarkable coincidence, and he responded, "I guess so, and that's what I said." The prosecution explained that Marielle and Marilyn placed Tracy on the phone with her mom at 11:40. However, the women can't recall seeing anyone else there at the time, but he claims he pulled in around 11:35. When explaining how they got into sex, he said they were just talking, and then JB got onto the bed and Koci joined her, and they started touching each other. He said it all happened pretty quickly, and they were done by 12:15 a.m. The prosecution kept challenging Koci's account, saying that it just didn't add up. They carefully went through what Koci said and found problems in every part of his story. The timeline didn't match, the evidence didn't make sense, and the prosecution further raised questions about why Koci initially told them that he didn't even know JB and Tracy. They explained he was only saying he knew them now because he had to find a way to explain why his scene was found, so he made up a story about consensual sex, a story that made no sense. The prosecution argued that the dirt on the inside of JB's jeans didn't come from consensual sex in the back of a truck. They came from being attacked and forced to undress by someone she doesn't know and doesn't want to have sex with. In the end, they said it was clear that Koci shot these girls because he didn't want to be held accountable for what he had done to JB. Both girls would have been able to identify him. The prosecution told the jury about the totality of circumstances. They said that when you consider all of the evidence presented, the pieces of the puzzle make a whole picture. They reminded the jury that guilt can be determined by circumstantial evidence. They said in this case, you don't have to actually see the defendant shoot and kill JB and Tracy to know that he did it. When it came time for the defense to give their closing arguments, they again said that there was no evidence to tie Koci to the murders. No fingerprints in the car, no witness testimony, no motive. There was just too much reasonable doubt, and he needed to be acquitted. I want your thoughts. My thoughts are, at some point, and I can't tell you when, but between the time Marilyn and Marielle left the girls and saw them turning, they encountered Koci. He might have broken down, but he saw the girls, and I think he did ask them for a ride. Since he was around their same age, and he was probably being very charming and convincing, they agreed to drive him to his house, which we know is close by. However, he pulled out a gun and forced the girls to drive to a secluded area, and then, of course, forced JB to get undressed and took advantage of her, and then shot both of them after he stuffed them into the trunk of her car, and then drove the car back to Herring Avenue, which was close enough to his house to walk home. On April 26th, after deliberating for just a day, the jury found Koci guilty on all counts. Some of the people who were at the trial told the media that Koci's testimony probably did more to make the jurors believe he was guilty than anything else they heard in court. But his friends and family still refused to believe he was guilty. His supporters gathered outside the courthouse, and many of them peacefully protested, holding signs with the words, "Koci strong," with Bible verses on the back and front. Next, the jury would have to determine if Koci would be sentenced to life or death. They asked many family members to read victim impact statements to highlight the loss that he had created. JB's mother, Cheryl, said, "I thought I knew the meaning of devastation, trauma, and being broken. I have a hole inside of me. It's not something you get over. I exist without her." Tracy's mom shared that the toughest moments for her family were during the holidays. The absence of Tracy was just an empty chair. Being there was so hard for them. Carol expressed how Tracy was not just her daughter, but her best friend. Every Mother's Day, she visits the cemetery. She spoke about the challenges of trying to have normalcy in her life for her sons, shielding them from the pain, and giving them a childhood that they deserve. She described how difficult it is, even decades later. However, the defense argued there were mitigating factors that showed that Koci should only have life in prison. He didn't have a criminal history. He was present in his children's and grandchildren's lives, and he was of value to others. Even his daughter, Alicia, talked about her childhood and how she grew up in a loving home. She never saw her parents fight or her father ever be aggressive towards anyone. Koci's wife said he is very family-oriented, a great father and a good man. His children need him, and she needed him. In closing, the prosecution told the jury that Koci already had 20 years free after murdering JB and Tracy, and that the man they saw today was a different man from back then. That man wasn't a godly man. He was a rapist and a murderer. In the end, the jury chose to send Koci to prison for the rest of his life and not sentence him to death. The Alabama Attorney General released the statement. For 23 years, the families of JB Beasley and Tracy Hallett have hoped and prayed for justice. While this outcome will not bring their loved ones back, my hope is that it will give them the much-delayed closure they deserve and will reinvigorate this entire community's faith in the justice system. The verdict handed down today sent a clear message. We have no tolerance in this state for those who callously take the lives of others, especially our youth. Koci's friends and family continued protesting about the verdict. On May 6th, they showed up to Cator Park to voice their concerns, claiming he was wrongly convicted. Koci was later formally sentenced to life without parole. He has appealed his conviction. The appeal is still pending. After the tragic deaths of JB and Tracy, a memorial was established close to where the Mazda was discovered. It's decorated with flowers, crosses, and angel statues, serving as a reminder that JB and Tracy will never be forgotten.